Is it a gnome?
It's a
Yeah,
it's a
All right, we are on the mic.
On the mic.
On the fucking mic.
mic.
This time with Sean. So today we're planning to do a little bit of recap on the last episode, mostly about AI and a little bit about democratic co-ops. And then we're going to try to get into free will, American foreign policy and empire, and whether or not there should be a world government. And we're also going to introduce Sean. So let's go ahead and do that, Sean. Tell us a
Hey,
little bit
guys.
about yourself.
Yeah, I'm Sean. I am going to school for social work. I work as a caregiver. My history, I kind of grew up in a small town. My father pushed business a lot, and so that kind of shaped my early childhood, like starting a business potentially. And then I slowly broke away from that and more into helping people. But I still have some of those business ideas that I push forward in my...
Yeah, for a long time you were just really wanting to start a business, and now it's social work. That's a big change.
Well, the thing with business is you can do it. Business is at anything and everything. Like you can use those concepts for every field. So I mean, what I want to do is become like a therapist for couples and individuals. So you can still use a lot of those ideas in therapy.
Nice.
Cool.
I think that covers most of it.
That's most of it. I'm sure we'll get more from context throughout our discussions.
Definitely. So last time when we got into AI and democratic co-ops with Chris as our guest, but no Sean. So
I know. I'm so sad I missed the AI because
Yeah, it was good.
So why don't you give us your thoughts on AI, just to kind of bring everyone up to speed on what you think about it?
Well, for me, I think AI is an inevitable form, the same way that we discovered the gun and the nuke. So we just have to create morals behind AI, and we have to use AI to bring all of us up and not just a few of us. I think that's the biggest step that we're going to have trouble with, and that's why we have to start talking about it, because it is something that's inevitable. We can't not develop it. It's going to be a part of our future. I've been kind of mixed, honestly. I think AI might, I don't know, I think they might be more superior to us, and maybe like down the road, if we're talking about like discovering different like solar systems and traveling the universe, our bodies can't do that. So we're gonna have to somehow merge with machines, or they're gonna take over completely.
That's your point of view.
That's down the road.
I suppose that's the classic fear, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's not even a fear for me, because I mean, I think it is about discovery, and it's just the next step. So it's not necessarily a fear that the human race is gonna, there's no need for it.
I mean, I guess my biggest worry about it is that without foresight or contemplation or exerting our conscious will over it, we're going to allow this technology to change what it means to be human in ways that we haven't fully chewed through. And we're going to lose parts of our humanity as a animal that we may regret, that may hold actually some of our more noble things, or the things that made life worth living.
Certainly.
Yeah, one of the biggest talks that I've been having with one of my friends who wants to go into he wants to go and basically get rid of death and obviously
immortality.
Yeah,
okay.
Immortality.
Wait, you watch Altered Carbon about that?
Well, no, and he's
horrifying.
He's totally down for that kind of stuff, though.
That's horrifying.
Well,
to me.
but I mean,
the
Sean
only way
points out too, the idea of being able to explore different planets,
I think
from
that
a biological standpoint doesn't really make sense. It would have to be machines that would be doing it, and
well, yeah, I mean that's assuming that we don't get some sort of much faster space travel. if we get some sort of like time warp or not time warp.
Or
but
just-
space
Well, it'd have to be
technology.
wormhole.
What about
right?
like cryo
Essentially,
stuff?
yeah,
Just
cryo
putting
would work
people
too.
to sleep.
Well,
we're
for long-
so
right.
we're so tied to oxygen in our atmosphere that we can't just go to Mars. There's just so
I
many
would say-
restrictions on it.
There are a lot of
Right. I would
restrictions.
say that just like be hesitant where you say can't, because like we don't know where the technology goes, because like we've been able to do so many things that we say now that like you couldn't do. Like one of the AI is one of those. AI is
Well,
like,
and AI also is, it's going to make things go at a much higher rate. I mean,
Totally.
AI is the next
Right.
industrial revolution.
Yeah.
We don't know how AI is going to, launch our science into the stratosphere. I mean, once we have autonomous AI researching things that we couldn't,
Yeah.
building on what we did, I mean, we have no idea what that's going to mean.
Well, one of the things that came to mind when I was talking to that guy, especially if we do like create a whole nother species of calling it a species is weird too, but like creating AI where we like think of it as like this whole other entity that's going to be evolving itself, whether it's intellectually or actually physically. It's like when you try to conceptualize morals, one of the things that like so many people speak about is like suffering and trying to diminish the amount of suffering that people have, and that's like one of the big premises for morality is trying to like act in a way that will decrease suffering or remove the like creation of suffering. And I think creating AI is going to make that talk a lot more complicated, because it's like, okay, well, is that bound then by that? Can the machine suffer? Can that like there's no like real pain sensors or anything like that, or like where do we stop our morality? Like with thinking about different species, it's like things that are more simple. Usually people like will have a line where they say, okay, well, I care not to kill these things, but then we'll get to this line, and then after that it's kind of whatever, I'll kill those, right?
So now we're talking about like at what point does AI become sentient enough to warrant our, moral caring about them and their
Sure.
rights?
Well,
Ever.
and
yeah,
vice,
I mean,
well,
that's, I
but
have
also
no idea.
vice versa.
Question.
What about them? Will they
Right.
care about our
Well, hopefully
suffering?
we're putting that into them as part of their basic,
Right.
Well, that's
foundational
what I-
programming.
I personally think that our biology is so slow that, machines are just, they're evolutionary better than us. And we might, like, when we're writing their code, we're going to have a part of us within them that, maybe their morals or just how they, perceive the universe. But I don't know. Where I get mixed up is how we're going to merge with machines, because we're
Right.
so tied to sex, to violence, to these things, but we also get love, we also have compassion, all these other things. I don't know how they're
It's
going to
tough,
tie
man.
together.
It's tough.
Or-
Well, that's Well, like some would argue that you couldn't have the love or anything like that if you didn't have the sex.
Because you're talking about immortality, and I think the only way for real immortality is to somehow get your consciousness into like a robotic, get it on like a hard drive, and
Well,
then
see, but that's a whole other tricky thing, because how much of what makes our consciousness is tied to our biological entity? I mean, if you take away the stomach brain, you're going to be a whole different thing than what you are right now. I mean, so much of how we define ourselves as human beings is tied to our bodies as much as it is our minds. You can't
And
compartmentalize those that easily.
I don't think it's necessarily true that the only way we could achieve functional immortality is through interfacing with machines either. I think that there's a lot of promising evidence in biological study these days that we could essentially stop the aging mechanisms.
I've been hearing that too.
That's
So-
how Hugh.
And that's currently the cutting edge of tech is biotech.
Yeah.
I just heard Chomsky talk, because he works at MIT, and he's saying you can tell where the economy is going based off of which companies move their buildings in next to MIT. And that when he first started there, it was all pharmaceuticals. Oh no, at first it was weapons manufacturers like Raytheon, Boeing, all these things. Then it switched to pharmaceuticals, and it's moving more and more into biotech, all surrounding MIT there. So that was interesting.
That is interesting. So yeah, I think
I've heard Obama mention it a couple times too. in
there's
speeches,
definitely there's a lot of promise in that field for essentially eradicating cancer through something akin to CRISPR, modifying genes and taking there's certain organisms that we know of that don't seem to get cancer at all, and so if we can study them and figure out why, we could perhaps integrate that kind of thing into our own genes. So cancer's a big one, and then our telomeres getting shorter is another one for our like genetic material essentially degrading over time, which is a huge part of why we age. And there's definitely some possibilities, because there's other organisms that don't have telomeres that get shorter, and so there's lots
like
of
lobsters, right? That are like immortal, right?
I think
There's definitely jellyfish.
Yeah, jellyfish. There's also naked mole rats don't get cancer. I don't know about lobsters. I think you might be right in terms of them being like functionally immortal. So anyway, there's lots of promise in that idea that like if something doesn't kill us, like getting stabbed or shot or something like that, that we could be functionally immortal and we could cure most diseases we could cure most genetic diseases, let's say.
Wow, I could see existential dread going through the roof.
Yeah.
Knowing that you could live forever unless something happens. Like the way we deal psychologically with the presence of danger, I mean, partially is detaching, knowing you're going to die anyway.
Right. That's
you
a good
know?
point.
I mean, that's a scary... There's going to be a lot of paranoids.
Oh, 100% on that. That was like, I think one of the easiest, like, scenarios to imagine is just the people who are the richest get it first, and then they're so
they're going to be
worried.
the worst versions of themselves that we already know of.
Exactly.
I mean, they were already that way when they had 100 years on them.
And it was really funny because DP and I were talking about this a little bit, and like they're right now basically the archetypical dragon, where they're holding on to their all of their hoard.
Totally.
And now they would be like basically immortal.
Gods.
Yeah.
Or demons, if you will.
Well, and that's yeah.
However you look at it.
Yeah.
Depending on your alignment.
But I mean, the biggest thing for me was that existential dread is at least held within morality. That was like philosophers have been trying to work with that for a long period of time. But if you remove suffering,
sorry, I had a thought. Anyway,
you're good. But if you remove suffering, like with AI, then is that even like will the AI even think about morality? Like we take our like intelligent brain, we take the intelligent brain, it's the more processing side of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, and we say, okay, well, we're gonna try to solve problems, and that's like most people associate that with objectivity and trying to boost like rationality, and we are going to like create something that's purely that, and that is almost removing morality. We have to we like buffer that with ethics. But ethics are like this outside force that hedge in our rational brain. Those are the premises that we work with.
So are you saying that our prefrontal cortex...
That we try to work with.
Do you think our logic brain is where our morality comes from?
No. I wouldn't say that's not where. I'm saying that there's going to be a
I just want to say lobsters are not immortal. Okay. They continually grow until they die, but they eventually just... Each molt requires more and more energy as they get bigger, and they eventually exhaust themselves to death.
Just
I don't know if their cells
greedy should have stayed small lobster.
Yeah, I don't know if their cells specifically exhibit immortality in the sense of like not aging. But
I guess it's worth it. The bigger they get, they're probably gonna fuck more. So
probably
go out with a bang, essentially.
All right. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, it wouldn't be that like. First of all of what I can say, like all of what I am saying is either like it can be checked. Like that's like there's gonna be parts of the brain that are more focused on problem solving than others. Okay, but like a problem is completely dependent on how you define the problem. Like there's a gajillion ways that you could solve the problem, but if you'll have different premises. So like if you actually want to, like we were talking about society earlier, do you want a commonwealth? Do you want I guess a healthy commonwealth? Or do you want just like some slaves?
Right.
Because those are two different problems, but still having to deal with like human interactions and stuff like that, and continuing certain kinds of like systems that are necessary.
Yeah, and I mean that really gets down to it because AI at the end of the day is just the power to deal with our problems in a much more fundamental way. So it depends on what your problems are, who you are, and what your problems are. Yeah. And if these robots are in the hands of the capitalist class, those are very different problems than if they're in the hands of the people.
The worry part to me is
but if it's true AI,
the generalized
that's the thing.
Well, no, but
they would break off from just one problem if you really
Right.
connected them to the
See, and
internet.
I don't know enough about the minutia here in terms of like, at what point is it no longer just something that's able to learn in order to solve tasks it's been given, or is it going to develop its own task creating mechanism? So
It's
There's
just
a
how
lot of big questions like that
Yeah.
I don't think anyone can necessarily answer, because once we give it the ability to reprogram itself, essentially,
that's
and it gets to be smarter than we are, then there's not a lot that we can, from what I understand at least, there's not a lot that we can 100% limit it
Yeah.
on, because it basically can do anything it wants at that point.
and
So,
that's
yeah,
well, because like you were talking about changing our biology is basically we're reprogramming ourselves. But imagine it's an AI that can do that a million billion times with whatever it wants, whenever it wants. Versus us, yeah, we can somewhat mess around with our DNA, but that gets really, really sketchy too.
it can for sure.
Because you could create, some super bug that just fucking
Well,
wipes us all out.
and if we think about it like cognitively, because it's like, for me, it's like the most useful to think of it as like, if we're going to create a general AI, it's important to think about what that means like for our brains, like how our general intelligence works. And most of the time, that is hedged in by this kind of like upper like top down morality that we've created, like
Yeah.
these rules that we've created through society of saying, okay, yeah, maybe we have a propensity to act this way, but maybe that's bad. And so
Yeah.
here's a rule to not do that. Like we can do that. But the other side is we also have all of these actual biological propensities that you do not have control over.
Right.
Or unless you practice like a Buddhist meditation for decades, then you might have a little bit more control over. But like, does an AI need to breathe? Does an AI need to eat? Because those all affect our morality.
Yeah.
If you get to
Yeah.
a point where you're just
Well, if you're
hungry,
starving, your morality changes drastically.
exactly. But this won't have that.
It's also interesting because you could make some sort of comparison in that, like, there will be a fundamental set of physics that will govern what the AI needs to quote unquote survive, right? Like if it gets too hot, its components might melt. So there will be things that it quote unquote needs.
Exactly.
They're
But
just going to
will-
be much more hardcore
Right.
than ours.
Yes, but what I was gonna say is, will there be any self-preservation
Exactly.
Right.
in that AI? Like, will it care if it dies?
See,
And
that's the
something
interesting
that
thing, too.
It's really hard to say because it's so hard to not, inscribe
Anthropomorphize.
these
Yeah.
human values or these human ideas into this. But there's no like hard and fast reason why it should have a self-preservation mechanism.
Well, I would argue that there's none for us either.
I would.
This is the cell thing that we were talking about literally the other day. We have a propensity to keep doing it. If that has a propensity to keep learning, what is going to stop it from learning more? If that's what its main drive is, if that's one of the main
Yeah,
drives.
but the
We don't know
drive to
what the drive
continue
is, though.
learning.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it could tie that to the need to continue existing.
Sure, but we don't know if it'll have any drive at all, though. That's what I'm saying. Like we.
I assume we're going to give it some kind of drive, or are we just going to give it? Is a drive different than tasks?
I would say.
But
I would say-
the task-
would disagree with that.
Well, it
I
depends
think,
on the
I think
limit of the
chemically,
task.
I would physically, I would disagree with that.
Well, but if the task is like,
We've
I
given
need
it
you
a
to build
process.
this thing,
Mhm.
that's different than kind of like a broad, like, I want you to learn everything you can. Because that goes for, like, an infinite amount of time.
Right.
Whereas a more limited task is a short-term thing it can accomplish.
But then it just stops.
Probably. I
Potentially.
mean, why would it not stop?
I mean, that's what we have right now. We have like ones that can play Dota, CS:GO.
Right.
We have AI that are literally just for games.
Well, yeah.
but we're talking.
we're
but you
talking
can do
about
that towards like engineering projects or
Did
whatever.
you guys hear about that creepy thing
We're just
where
talking about
multiple
two animals. Yeah,
AIs
we're
like
talking-
made their own language and were talking to each other and researchers didn't know
And
what
we
they were
didn't-
saying?
yeah, we
So we
didn't
had to pull the
realize
plug.
Strange.
Yeah.
So
That's-
strange.
And that's just kind
creepy.
of that's one thing that I would
Why?
say
Why do you do it?
would get in the way of what you're saying. Yeah.
Well, I
so
don't-
like
But that's the thing is we just don't. So many. It's like all these AIs. We don't know the parameters under which they are constructed. We don't know the rules of the game.
but we also don't necessarily. What I'm saying is there's also implicit rules that we don't know.
Yeah, I mean we don't know shit.
So what I'm
No
saying is
idea
like
what the AI is gonna look like.
you obviously will. You could constrain it. We could constrain it basically but I would think it would have to be in kind of a biological parameter by like saying like, because there's a way that you can use biotech to be like, okay, you're gonna live for this many cycles, so we're gonna hit you with it, and then that kind of cell will live within you as long as it can reproduce, but there will be a population limit where it will go away, because we can use biological constraints, because that happens inside like ecosystems anyways. But my thing is like, once you start a process, you have to know everything that limits that process. And what we're trying to do is do that intellectually, but naturally that occurs.
Right.
That's just like the idea would be that you have to kind of create telomeres for the AI, something that it can't control, it doesn't have, but that will end it.
Yeah, I mean, that's one way you could constrain it. I could see that potentially working, assuming we don't give it the ability to... Assuming that it doesn't have the ability to somehow circumvent that, right?
Well, that's what we're trying to do right now. So that's what I'm, like...
What I was talking about, though, is specifically whether or not it would have any desires at all, or like an instinct of self-preservation.
But do you see how... I'm just saying that, okay, this could all be true, but I'm just saying that we get into the problem of now trying to apply that to a human too. We get that into just regular life. What is different between us and that machine that we're creating that is a set of processes?
We don't know.
Yeah.
Now we're getting to free will, because that's a big part of the free will debate.
For sure, that is. And so it's interesting because, you know, one of the main drives of evolution in general is a will to live, basically, right? A will to live and a will to reproduce. Mm-hmm. And those two things, without them, organisms die off and they no longer exist.
So the only organisms that would keep living are the ones that have it, and so eventually all of them would have it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So whether or not we understand what that is in ourselves, we know that it has to be there or we would have died. But something that we create out of nothing that doesn't necessarily share our biology or anything doesn't necessarily have to have that kind of an idea.
Yeah, who's to say mutations even would happen within AI? I mean, it would depend on how they're made. I don't know.
Yeah.
And I think these are all wonderful things that I don't even know if we should like. I mean, I think it would be nice. The idea would be that. So we didn't create that will. We didn't create the will, right? We evolved the will out of nowhere,
Well,
which
we
would also
came about after the will. So
Yeah.
by definition, we couldn't not have it.
Fair. So, but the idea would be that if we're gonna go from a materialistic standpoint, which is usually like, I don't know, like for science base, that's normally like where we start, and then we can get into like more consciousness stuff that's like a little bit more like woo-woo. But coming from a materialistic standpoint, there's going to be like constraints that are given by the system that you're working in. Right? So there's going to be chemical reactions that occur more frequently because they are just easier to, there's enough energy and there's enough resources to do. So that would be the idea of why DNA is this like made up of 4 bases that are like organic molecules. It's because those are very available and the amount of energy that was required was there.
Yeah.
Right?
And they're extremely stable.
Exactly.
So are you saying you do think it could mutate once it's made?
Well, I'm saying that it is constrained just as much as we are physically.
Well, I don't know, because we exist within the biological parameters because we have to. However, we could make something outside those parameters.
Well, we couldn't make it outside of physics, and
True.
that's
so it's
that
still
we constrained by that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's weird too. When we can't.
But as far as I know, there's plenty of things in physics that don't mutate. You know, I mean, this is a construct. So I mean, it's like it's like.
Well, that's what
it depends on what you mean by mutate, though. Because if we're creating an actual AGI, like a generalized AI that can change and like become more intelligent than we are, then if the way that I look at mutation in this context is just changing what we gave it, and so I think by definition it's going to have that for sure.
Well, I guess I mean more. I guess I mean more. Is it going to be able to have things created within it that we did not give it the parameters to create?
And that's a huge question.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the big. So I think there's a couple sources of fear within the AI talk, and one of them is what Sean brought up about, several rich people kind of subjugating the world, basically. I think that's a very real concern.
That's more my focus. Because I think at
that's
this
more
point,
likely.
it's more important, especially for the layman,
Mhm.
to focus on the social, economic, and political context in which AI emerges.
Definitely. I think that's the smart play, because AI is such a niche knowledge base
Yeah.
that even the experts don't necessarily agree on what it'll be like, how long it'll take to make, all these things. And so I think it's best if we start looking at it in a broadly moral context of like, what do we want it to do, what do we like hope that it'll be constrained by, and how can we possibly implement that, and then try to leave those kinds of things up to the experts as best we can,
Right.
while we sort of figure out the political impact
Right.
as a
And then that
society.
it just falls on ownership. Who owns the AI, and do the AI have to pay taxes, or yeah,
Well, I mean,
it's
do we
all a
even need
money
taxes
game.
at that point.
Yeah, are they gonna base? I mean, the kind of the best circumstance would be like machines and AI basically cover the base for everyone. They make housing, food, healthcare, all of it for all of us, and then we can actually start going for the things that excite us into answering some of the questions of the universe.
That excites some of us,
Especially
especially those in this room. But
True.
but I
But
mean,
I mean,
we
you're
can
still
start.
gonna have services. You're still gonna have things for, I guess, your average person.
and I hope to God we do, because I think that there are a lot of people.
Well, the society
who-
couldn't survive us not providing that.
Yeah, I would think.
Right.
Just because
it
people
could be
wanted
provided
that.
by the AI.
Right.
But it's likely that at some services like massage or something like that will
Because I think we're
remain.
still going to want that human. We want a human society.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then it's going to be like, once we have AI that look and sound like people,
Dude,
it's going to be able to trick.
Also, we already, I mean,
Well,
if we
not
take
allowed
into,
to, yeah.
like, the idea of, like, Instagram into consideration, we already,
Yes.
there's plenty of people who idolize the beautiful people that they see on that. It's
Yeah.
like, there's plenty of things where people will look at something, look at, like, a Rembrandt or any kind of art piece and be like, there's that, I could never fucking do that, and then they just don't do it, even though it might be, like, good for them. So you're trying to say that if there's a service that is given by an AI, that would obviously be the best, because that's, I guess, what we're thinking about. It's like,
Well, I
who's
wasn't
gonna
even
take that on?
necessarily saying that. I was actually more saying that there'll still be the opportunity for an economy for people in a world where there's AI, because there's a lot of things that people want that human-to-human interaction, in receiving a service. Especially in a world where, like, our basic needs aren't really an issue anymore. It's going to be more... I mean, there's going to be an explosion of the service industry and things like... I mean, I don't even know what that would look like, but...
This is
I mean,
all
weird art
predicated.
salons on the street, crazy. Who knows? It could
This
be
is all
awesome.
predicated on the assumption that we can roll out some sort of AI that then will cover the basic needs.
Yes, a
And
lot
then-
of hypotheticals.
And then we
here.
have like some sort of universal basic income so that
Yeah.
people can still go and participate
and then
in
an
these services.
egalitarian
And then-
view of society.
And then if they want to, create their own business or provide some sort of service like that, they get additional income that they can then use for,
Right.
extra things. or
Right.
whatever.
Because that's what
This is
Elon
like a
Musk.
utopian idea of what
Yeah,
we could
is
do.
But
kinda
AI
what
has
he-
always been the crown jewel of utopian sci-fi.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a real
Or
possi-
magic. But,
Right. Right.
Honestly, what we're conceiving of is sort of the same. you
Yeah.
know?
I mean,
That's right.
utopian thinking made no sense until AI.
Right.
Now
I
I
agree.
think we need to talk about, and I never think we could achieve utopia,
No.
Yeah.
but
It's always gonna
we
be-
need to start talking about what our utopia looks like so that we can gear these developments in that direction.
dude, I mean, that is the point of utopia, right?
Yeah, Plato.
I mean, Plato,
Yeah.
that's why he did it.
Yeah.
Would be like, this is the
But it's-
conceptualized
I think a lot of
idea
people
we
don't
should aim
understand
at.
that.
Okay,
Because
fine.
utopian thinking is its own thinking, where it's like you think you can create a perfect world.
Yeah.
And therefore, it becomes a fundamentalist point of view, because then you think, well, any obstacle in between me and my perfect world is the enemy and can be destroyed now, and I can justify that.
Yeah.
So there's a danger in utopian thinking, for
Totally.
sure.
Totally.
But if you understand it as an intellectual and philosophical exercise,
Yeah.
to where you're clarifying what your utopia looks like so that you have something to guide your efforts,
Totally.
that's a good thing. And I think we need to be doing that. Very much.
I agree.
I think that also ties into empire stuff too, though.
Yeah.
Yeah. And world government and all that jazz.
Unless we have something to say about the democratic co-ops, I think we should get into.
Well, I did want to cover, just kind of like what we were talking about before the show.
Sure.
But yeah, that was a really interesting discussion with Chris,
Definitely.
and we were kind of talking about how I definitely got a little flustered with how he was being pretty aggressive in the beginning there. Before I was able to get my piece out, but we ended up having a really good conversation. One of the points like I was saying earlier, I really appreciated his kind of concern about the idea of changing an economic system.
Definitely.
And we were talking about, whether it was the industrialization or feudalism to capitalism or communism. But then the point we were talking about earlier was that, that's also something that happens within the economic system we have, whether it's, AI revolution like we're talking about now that's going to radically change the world, or the way cars have changed our society, or the way that the tech boom has changed society. And that has huge cultural ripple effects, like the way the family has changed now that you can't live off of a one-income household.
Definitely.
And that, especially as we're approaching these radical technological changes, the idea of radically changing our economic system becomes far less far-fetched in my mind, and even necessary.
But does it have to be radically changing? Or can we slowly push it towards... Isn't it more realistic to slowly change our economy?
That's
or is
a
it more of a democratic... Well, what we were talking about, just having incentives for companies to switch to democratically owned...
Yeah, I agree with that. And I'm in favor of any and all, incremental movement towards that. I think that's a positive thing.
I mean, one of the things that does bum me out so much about the economy right now is that I see it as though we're talking about this idea of the utopian and having goals. That in my mind is just a set of goals that we're aiming towards, and it seems as though there's a scientific hesitation to analyze the economy and seeing whether or not it's actually leading towards those goals that we
I think that's a very tricky area, because watching Joe Rogan a lot lately, when he has all these different scientists on, one of the core themes that they talk about is how politicized science actually is. Because there's a lot of ramifications in terms of how you get your funding. And if what you're wanting to look into is too controversial, or you're gonna get on your senator's nerves about it, they're gonna start getting phone calls. Why did this scientist get funding to do this study? There was a sex researcher on, and he couldn't even get into studying non-monogamous forms of relationships in the kind of way he wanted to at his university because of the controversy. And so there's controversy on that. I mean, there's no more strictly guarded intellectual exercise in this country than capitalist economic system.
Yeah, that's
and
crazy.
So the idea that we would have scientists, methodically and rationally critiquing the capitalist system and comparing it to our goals and our ideals and exploring alternatives, I just don't think that's going to happen in the current atmosphere.
No, I would agree. It's just, I just wanted to bring it up just because it was so, it's so weird.
I agree with you. I've thought about
It's definitely a huge problem that we have such constraints on scientific research, because the idea of science should be that you can research kind of wherever it takes you. There's certain things that maybe we could talk about shouldn't be looked into, but I feel like that's almost it's kind of like trying to put a pin around a child to keep them from hurting stuff. It's if we're responsible about it, we should be able to look into anything and learn about it and use that to better the society. And that's one of the frustrating things for me. Just an example of stuff that's not able to be researched is drugs. We have very little research on marijuana or LSD or ecstasy, or MDMA rather, and psilocybin, and those are all drugs that have way fewer negative side effects than alcohol, and oftentimes
and huge mental health,
incredible mental health potential, potential to treat mental illness, and so it's just ridiculous that we can't research those.
I know.
And meth is considered a Schedule 4 substance, and marijuana.
Schedule 1.
Or sorry, Schedule 2 I meant.
Oh.
Meth is Schedule 2. And marijuana and MDMA and I think LSD are all Schedule 1.
And no one in the culture is not, just by common sense, aware that meth is the worst of them all. Like, we all know that.
Yeah.
We all know
Yeah.
it's not a big deal.
Right?
So why does our legal system...
Yeah, I mean, I talk about intellectual dishonesty. That's like, grade A intellectual dishonesty.
Well, and again, it gets into political issues. I mean, you had that former member of the Nixon administration come out when he got out of prison and say, after Vietnam, we had to target our political enemies in the culture with this whole, counterculture revolution. And so we took the drugs that were associated with our two enemies, which was the black community politically organizing and anti-war leftists, and they took the two drugs associated with those two groups, and they just went to war on them in the culture. And then he said, and by that means we were able to spy on them, disrupt their communities, break up their organizing.
Oh my God.
So
Yeah, I also
That's
psilocybin is
disgusting.
Schedule 1, which is insane.
yeah, it's crazy.
It's ridiculous. And So anyway, the fact that science is so politicized, I think, is a huge problem, because that's a really good example in my mind of an area that should be heavily researched and is not getting hardly any research because no one can get funding for it.
Well, you wonder, it's like, I guess for me it's always complicated too, because like you want to have this idea, a lot of people like to think about capitalism as being this like free entity, where it's like it's a system that was put in place that is used to like organize resources based on this kind of democratic voting, that you go to like a store and you get to pay,
I call that a huge misrepresentation. But...
Right. But would that not be like the common mythology?
Right.
Of, like
Yeah,
that's
the
the
myth
system?
of it, yeah.
So, and I guess it's like, it's confusing. Like, I get that, and then you saying, okay, well, science should also be something that is, like, constrained by that, because there's so many things we could research, so shouldn't we research the things that most people want?
Right.
That would be, like, the idea, and then, like, now it's contained within that capitalistic sphere, and then we can funnel in resources towards more research. But, for me, it's also like, okay, fine, even if we grant all of that, which is, kind of bullshit anyways, if we grant that, it's like, why are we not doing it for the things that most people would benefit from then at that point? Like, why is there not, like, more money going towards, like a study of the economic system and whether or not we could add more laws or
Where's the money
benefit?
coming from, and do they have their own interests?
Exactly.
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
So-
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
This is an interesting aside about the drug conversation. A Johns Hopkins research study that just got published said that the researchers were recommending that psilocybin be reclassified from Schedule 1 to Schedule 4.
Well, there's been a lot of movement lately on the health potential for like shrooms and LSD.
The Schedule 4 drugs are like Xanax, Soma, Valium, and Ambien. Like those are. All
So you would
Schedule
still need a prescription, but
yes.
but
Schedule
still.
5 is where you can get it over the counter.
Okay.
Yeah.
But psychiatrists could actually give that to people.
Yeah.
Well, and based
That'd
off what I've been reading and listening to, that's probably a good thing, because they were saying that like
Oh yeah.
this has huge potential, but it could also be a triggering event for you spiraling into worse mental health.
Yeah. I mean, you
So
don't-
that so you should have someone who knows what they're doing, guiding the experience,
Totally.
making sure you're a good candidate for it, all these different preliminary,
Real. And that's like, I mean, I think a lot of people would argue that would be best for all of drugs, but there has to be a line at which you're just like, because you can still die on aspirin, you can still die on alcohol,
All
you
the
can
time.
you can become an alcoholic on alcohol,
Yeah,
destroy your life that
I mean,
way.
how can cigarettes be
like,
legal
cigarettes.
in this context? Yeah.
And I'm sure there's some ethical.
ridiculous.
I'm sure there's an ethical line where it's like, well, you can drink a certain amount of alcohol and shit doesn't go wrong. So there's that. But
Well,
if you take,
It's just a lack of intellectual consistency, because it's
Yeah.
it's like if you're gonna say
Well-
alcohol and cigarettes are okay, and marijuana is 100% not,
yeah,
you're
well
being
that's
a fucking idiot.
marijuana would be a case.
Or
where,
you got
again,
ulterior motives.
No,
Those
that
are
one-
the only options.
I think marijuana is one of the ones that is so obvious, like
Yeah.
ulterior
Yeah.
motives. But when it does come something like shroom or LSD, it's like sometimes one dose is too much.
Yeah,
You know?
I mean, they were saying there was examples of people where it's like, they did shrooms and that was the triggering event for their schizophrenia,
Yeah.
or something like that.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
I mean, if they have all the predispositions and they have,
Mhm. Yep.
they're ready to pop, that could be what makes them pop.
Mm.
So,
But then you don't give that drug to those
I guess. I mean, I think it would have to be something where you're evaluated by a psychologist, and they're like, no, this person's too unstable, and they've got a genetic history in their family of schizophrenia, and so we don't think this falls into safe parameters for using this.
But I mean, it goes. So me and Kendall were having a conversation about gun control and maybe having a bigger test to when you're purchasing a gun. But then it's like, where do you draw the line? Do you go see a therapist and then you put in some of those schizophrenia?
I think that is actually a super good conversation to have.
It is.
The gun one is a little bit difficult just because that one is like exterior to yourself, and now you're going into behaviors.
You're getting rid of people's liberty with the drug thing. You're saying this drug, we're offering it to people, but we're going to limit it.
Well, it's not like, it's a little tough too, because it gets into constitutionality as well, because it's not like there's a constitutional amendment, the right to bear mushrooms.
Maybe we should add it.
Maybe even take medicine.
Yeah, that's the other thing is, like, we have tons of medicines that we do that with already. Right. You know, like, you can't just walk into an office, a doctor's office, and be like, I'd like some Haldol. And they'll just be like, okay. You know, like, people have to go through rigorous tests and decide, like, a professional has to decide that that's what you need. And so there's definitely a case to be made for, putting psilocybin, MDMA, and LSD all in that sort of a classification of things that we could maybe use to treat stuff. And, the whole, like, recreational use is another discussion. But whether or not we want to have it as something that can be used as a medicine.
We just need more knowledge. I mean, it goes back to the funding. We need more knowledge about these drugs, how they affect the brain, who the best candidate would be for them.
And that's one of the biggest things about rescheduling all of those, is then we could get research done on them. Because Schedule 1 is basically like there's no medical use for them. That's the definition.
Just such bullshit.
And they have a high probability for abuse and addiction. So that's what Schedule 1 means. And so it's clearly just wrong. Like, we know that.
Well, by that definition, alcohol should be Schedule 1.
For sure. Well, it is it does actually have some medical use in terms of, like, a drink a day has been proven to increase your health.
Right, but certainly no more than something like shrooms.
No, definitely not.
That's got huge potential.
You could definitely make a case for alcohol being Schedule 2, I think.
Yeah.
That would be easy.
Yeah.
And certainly,
but we won't do that.
Well, we tried.
The prohibition.
Prohibition was not fun. So.
Yeah, it was definitely one of the big overreaches of the progressive movement.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's a huge case to be made for legalizing essentially all of those drugs, based on the idea of the drug war being horrible.
I'm generally under the idea of
I think an ideal state, people don't get to take those drugs if they like Sean was saying, like, there's some sort of screening involved, like if you might become schizophrenic because of some psilocybin dose, like, you probably shouldn't do it. But I think the more realistic thing to do is to legalize them all.
I agree.
Tax the fuck.
Heavily regulate, tax.
Yes. Yeah.
See, that's where I kind of disagree with the weed tax.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's also a political move. I mean, it's a way to
that's
get
what
people
I'm saying.
on board
It's
with the
politically
decriminalization.
when like weed is something that if you want to smoke it, you should be able to smoke it. Why do you have to pay 25% to the government? Because it's a political move.
I feel like that's reasonable because it's a recreational thing. Like, it's not something that you need, quote unquote. And if you do need it, you can get like a medical card for it so that you don't pay as much. And so at that point, it's like, why should we not have luxury taxes? I think that's a reasonable thing to do, especially since there are some negative health benefits.
But then we should have that on potato chips and soda.
We should. I totally agree. There should be a sugar tax.
That is like
100%.
That one's been argued for sure, and I think so too.
Because I mean, they drew the line way up there for weed, but then I mean, if you're using that logic, it's not across the board.
Yeah, it's important for us to kind of like go through that.
There is a cigarette tax, though. I mean, it's in the same vein.
I do agree with the idea of sin taxes or luxury taxes.
Yeah, I agree.
What level they should be at should be argued.
Yeah.
I think the weed one's probably higher than it needs to be, maybe, but I also think that was an important step in legalizing it because it was a way to get like the police departments to stop fighting it, things like that, where you put a bunch of money towards the police departments and say, hey, stop it. From the taxes. A lot of the taxes in, like, say, Oregon, where we are, for the weed legalization goes to schools and police departments.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think, moving forward with especially legalizing the scary drugs like heroin, for instance.
Oh.
Like that one, I think 100% of the tax revenue should be put towards rehabilitation programs.
Yeah.
And, you know, mental
Dealing with
health
the
and
underlying
healthcare.
problems that lead people to using it.
Exactly, and the fallout from when people do.
Yeah.
I think those are like, it makes a ton of sense to put as much revenue towards that as possible.
Yeah.
So I mean, is that for like the weed tax? Is that just going to the? Is that actually directed towards anything, or is that 25% just going back into the state and they get to use it on roads or whatever?
I don't know what it's doing, if it's changed, but I do remember looking into it when they passed the law, and a huge percentage of it was going towards schools and criminal justice. So that was a way to say, look, we're funding our education more, and simultaneously we are placating the law enforcement community with a bribe, essentially. Which, I mean, there's definitely ulterior motives there with law enforcement as well, because I mean they get a lot of their resources in being able to go after these drug offenders. You know, I mean, whether it's like drug task force or, you know, various shit.
Yeah, and so I think definitely putting money towards that so that we can restructure our law enforcement agency. Because, like, if you think about it, if we legalize pretty much all drugs, then what is the DEA gonna do? I mean, they could go after. There'd probably still be illegal trafficking of some of those drugs, but after a while,
well, law
the hope that it would
enforcement
die
in
out.
general would suffer a hemorrhage
Yeah.
in terms of its, you know, funding and its scope.
Or we might have to think about how we actually want to use that.
Yeah.
that
Well, I agree. I think our law
resource.
enforcement system needs to be massively overhauled
I agree.
and pulled back from a lot of the fronts it's engaged in.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, if we're going to get into, you know, the military giving them old military equipment, the militarization of the police,
Right.
you know, the prison system in our country, which is beyond
So gross.
grotesque.
Well, I think it all comes down to the idea that our justice system right now is centered on punitive justice. So I think
It's also gotten tangled up in capitalism.
Yeah.
I mean,
The fact that it makes
you have-
money is a problem.
yeah, for-profit prisons or prison
Or
labor.
hospitals for. Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, so like one of the Democratic senators who's probably going to be running for president, she's a establishment type, Kamala Harris. She was, I don't know this super well, so forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think she was the Attorney General in California.
Oh, okay. I
She's
was
a California
thinking of
senator.
The Hawaiian. There's a Hawaiian.
Tulsi Gabbard.
I think
I
that
love
her.
Tulsi Gabbard.
Was she the one on Joe Rogan
Yeah,
recently?
she's great.
Is
She
she
was
a
on Jimmy
senator?
Dore too. Yeah, she's a senator
Nice.
from Hawaii.
Yeah, she sounded really cool.
She
I
was
liked
the
her a lot.
first one to come out for Bernie. And she actually lost her position it was like up in the higher ranks of the Democratic Party because she came out for Bernie.
Jeez.
Yeah.
I like how it's coming out. Like, get out of the closet.
I
We
wish
know you like Bernie.
I wish she would go as his VP
That'd be awesome.
for 2020 because she picks up all of his weak points. She's a young minority woman from the military with a focus on foreign policy and reeling in empire.
That's insane.
Fuck yeah.
That's a winning ticket for
perfect.
sure.
Whoa.
Um,
Bazinga.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Anyway, what were you saying?
Oh, jeez. Anyway, so Kamala Harris, I think she was the former Attorney General in California, and there was a few issues with her, but one of the big ones was that like the state of California told her department to release a bunch of like nonviolent offenders or something like that. And her department's response was, well, we can't do that because we'll lose jobs in the prison.
She worked in the San Francisco District Attorney's Office and the City Attorney of San Francisco's office. In 2004, she was elected District Attorney of San Francisco.
Okay.
And was elected California's Attorney
There
General
it is.
in 2010, and then re-elected in 2014. And then in 2016, she got into the Senate.
Yep. So she's essentially the successor to the Clinton wing of the party. You know, anyone who talks against her progressive credentials, they're calling racist or sexist on the left, and
Oh, that's gross.
trying to counter any Bernie people attacking her early on. She's not going on small dollar donations. She's got a super PAC and taking big money and all that shit. So yeah.
Great.
Bummer.
Anyway.
Is Bernie running in 2020?
Yeah.
Nice.
It's pretty much
Did he-
guaranteed.
I know he.
Everyone
kinda hinted
close
towards it,
to
but
him in his campaign is saying it's happening.
Yeah.
And I've seen a couple interviews where he plays around with the question. So
That'd be sweet if Tulsi, what was her name?
Tulsi Gabbard.
Tulsi Gabbard.
She's got a great record.
I
I think
think
she'd
so.
be a perfect running mate for him.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
Bernie Gabbard.
2020.
Yeah, dude. I'm all over it.
2020.
I'm on that train.
Is Clinton pretty much done? I hope
Yeah.
so. Yeah,
God,
she
I hope
has
so.
to.
I don't
be,
think she
right?
wants to be, but
Such
she
a
is.
cunt.
Well, no one else is.
Ugh.
Oh, that's a strong one.
I mean it. I mean every bit.
I
of
mean,
it.
I'm no Hillary fan. Yeah, no, I do despise. That's the thing is, it's not just about her as a person. Like, I despise the entire political apparatus and ideology that she represents,
Yep.
which is, the corporate Democratic establishment, the whole turning away from the New Deal with Bill Clinton and becoming Republican light and all of that. I could go into that for a whole episode.
Yeah, it's gross.
Not to mention the tactics used in the 2016 election, which in and of themselves have drastically radicalized my points of view. So congratulations, Democratic Party.
Yeah. I hope that worked on a lot of people.
Oh, yeah, I think it spawned a lot of political upheaval
Good.
on the left, seeing that happen.
I think that's what we need, because one of the things that's happened to the left is it's become like a caricature of what it's supposed to be.
Well, I mean, it was... Dude, it was... I don't want to blame the left, because the left was savagely attacked during the Cold War. I mean, there was a left-wing inquisition. An inquisition against the left in this
Right.
country.
Like the communism.
The Red Scare.
The Red Scare, dude.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it was hardcore.
Yeah.
I mean, there used to be communist and socialist parties in this country that were mainstream. You had Eugene Debs in World War I get 3 million votes trying to win against Woodrow Wilson. From jail. They put him in jail and he still got 3 million votes.
Jesus, that's crazy.
I mean, fuck, dude. And that was the Socialist Party of America.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's crazy.
it's just frustrating because what they've turned into is such a joke, and it's like all the stupid issues that I think they just don't talk about anything that really matters anymore.
Well, they've been
No one does,
effectively channeled into non-threatening avenues.
Yeah.
That's really what it is.
And they're just like calling the race card or the gender card
Yeah.
or whatever. They just have these cards that they play of this bullshit.
That's because folks, first of all, it can be easily used as a political weapon.
Yep.
Second of all, focusing on those things from the point of view of the Democratic Party itself is a very effective way to steer the conversation away from anything that actually endangers their power
Yeah.
or the interests of their donors. Because, it's like Martin Luther King said when he started moving towards economic justice, it didn't cost the nation 1 penny to integrate lunch counters. It didn't cost the nation 1 penny to give the black man the right to vote. We're needing to talk about things that are going to cost billions of dollars now.
Yeah.
Like, that's really where this is. And you see that MLK is a perfect example. As soon as he went to economic justice instead of racial justice, liberal whites turned on him. Like, hardcore, almost immediately, especially in the establishment.
Yeah. It's fucked up.
And it's so ironic because if you're actually going to talk about, racial justice or, feminism or, gender issues, you can't talk about those without dealing with economic injustice or capitalism or, government by moneyed interests.
Totally.
I mean, you can't. You can't.
Well, I mean, you just look at it. Yeah, it's how it functionally
Yeah.
works. It's
I mean,
like,
how do you talk about a prison industry that's, got all these minorities locked up and not talk about, the economic system that spawns where they came from, or the prison system that benefits off of their what is essentially slave labor.
Well, one thing that Harari. So I'm gonna probably talk a little bit like or bring in a lot of Sapiens because.
Dude,
that's-
I'm glad you're listening to that.
Yeah, I just went through it like really quick.
It's so good.
But one of the things that he brought up that I thought was really good was his. He said that like racism is now changed to like culturism, but there's no real word that's been used for culturism. But instead, there's obviously explicit racism.
So what do you
which is
mean by
just-
that? What's
But yeah,
culturism?
so what I was gonna say is like culturism is the same idea of like attacking someone, but instead for their culture. So you would say, because like the only thing that would then be like, yeah, you say like, okay, well look at the systems that they're working in, right? What the minorities are working in, because like you would hope that, well, if you say that the economic system and the justice system are working functionally correct, then you have to like somehow account for the fact that there is a disproportionate amount of minorities that are in the prisons.
Right.
And so you would say, oh well, it's their culture.
Yeah, right.
And then it's like and then you can be like, oh well, I'm not being racist. It's just their cultures are centered on these bad morals, and they end up like fighting each other a lot and attacking each other.
Okay, first of all, we could certainly critique that in and of itself.
Real. And
but then even giving that ridiculous statement, to then say that you can separate the culture as it exists now from where it's come from.
Yeah.
I mean, emerging through the darkness of slavery and Jim Crow Reconstruction and all these things. I mean, they've never been able to escape into, you know, a position of equality. I mean, it's never happened in a broad sense.
No, totally. And I mean, Harari definitely is. He uses it as like the same negative connotation that racism is. So he's basically like he was specifically talking about empire when he brought this up, and it was just the fact that there's a lot of the time
saying a culture is inferior and thus we have the right to dominate.
Exactly.
Oh,
and that's that's so on point.
Well, I mean, you can tear apart that analysis just by looking at, you know, what's the number one existential crisis we face right now on this planet, besides the nuclear war, of course, which has been there since we made them, is climate change. And so the culture that we use that argument to destroy completely the Native Americans had the cultural lessons in place that right now would be saving us.
Yeah.
So there goes that argument.
Totally. Totally.
Yeah,
and
I think like 7 generations into the future, right? Isn't that their whole mentality?
I mean, I'm sure it varies a lot tribe to tribe, but that's
I mean, that would
there's
be
a
good
constant
one, right?
theme of prioritizing future generations and
Thinking
borrowing
long
this
and
planet
short.
from your children and all that stuff.
Totally.
Well, it just makes a lot more sense because they thought of it in much more like cyclical nature. And like if we're taking out more than the cycle can replenish, then eventually, you know, like the math doesn't add up. And it seems like that'd be kind of an easy thing to figure out.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I mean, thinking of things in terms of cycles is certainly much more based in reality than how we do it in the West, which is a linear progression.
Well, and I think one of the things that I get annoyed with, and I'm sure you do too, with like the whole idea of like studying like different religions and mythologies and stuff like that and how they work and like the lessons that they teach, is like, and I'm sure Sam Harris would get annoyed at this too, is like if we actually take into consideration the like biological and just like the functioning of the biosphere, those are all cycles. We call them that. We say this is the nitrogen cycle.
Yeah.
This is the water cycle.
All cycles.
Yeah, it's like
life and death.
Exactly.
And we're literally trying to, with technology, change that though.
It's true.
To create.
Well, but you can't. The idea would be you don't change the.
Create permanency.
But you don't get. But the cycles replenish the permanency.
Right.
The processes are what create the amount, the length of time that we're able to be alive, anyways.
Yeah, I mean, even if you get to the farthest extension of that, you know, conversation, I mean, eventually the universe is going to end.
Right. That's what I was going to bring up. Is that if we look at it from a biological aspect, everything is cyclical for the most part. Although you can look at a lot of you could look at evolution maybe as like a linear type thing, but I would say that if you look at things from the standpoint of physics, everything is much more linear, which is like it just goes. And energy is becoming, or things are becoming less and less ordered. So chaos is prevailing, and eventually, you know, the overall energy of the universe is getting more and more spread out and less usable, and eventually that will just.
Well, but that's only linear if it doesn't repeat.
That's true, but we have no basis for
True. But
thinking that it
the whole realm before the universe and after it is a blind spot. So we
have no idea
define anything based off of either being linear or cyclical.
One of the ideas that has also been brought up philosophically is that we as humans think linearly because what we do is we make projections and then that creates linear time. But with physics, it's not. Those are predictions, right? And you're using constants, which are atemporal. They don't have time associated with them. They will be, this is a constant that happens no matter what. And then you place that in this kind of projection, where you would then say, okay, well, we're right here, now let me create time, and then say this far in the future, I'm going to create a projection where if all of these things stayed atemporal, they like didn't change, that's what's going to happen. So the idea is that physics is atemporal, biology is cyclical, and then we can create that we create the linear in our brains. It's not actually real in the moment, I guess, would be like in the actual system that we're dealing with.
I mean, that's a good point, because we are filtering everything through our own ideas, of course. And I would say, human lifespan is something that seems very linear right now.
Totally.
Right? We don't Benjamin Button at any time in our life, right? And so a lot of particles in physics don't necessarily obey our conventional ideas of time. Like sometimes they will travel backwards in time from what we know, that's how we conceive of them, at least. And so I suppose it may be more of a remedial idea to think that it is linear, and perhaps if we were to increase our understanding of physics, maybe a lot of it is more cyclical than we understand, or seems more like less constrained by time. But at least from our perspective, it does certainly seem like time is moving one direction, and we have no access.
Oh, real. Okay, so I'm not saying, so for the individual, I would never say that for the individual, time wouldn't appear linear, for sure.
Yeah.
Because that's how we...
But isn't it non-linear from, the fourth dimension or something like that? I don't know much about this shit. There's that whole idea that, we're trapped in linear time. But that's just one, if you go up to another dimension, all of time exists simultaneously or something like that,
Yeah. Well,
that's all theoretical, of course.
Right, that's not like no one's been there.
But,
unless you took enough LSD.
For me, it's also just, actual, linear time is good for projections and good for future. It's basically future telling. You're trying to do premonitions of what will happen. So, and science has been argued to be the best tool for that. That's what but the idea would also to be don't get confused and think that that's real, because what you're doing is imagining something.
Sure.
And you may be, even if you are accurate, it doesn't the idea would be it's only useful when you're trying to solve, when you're trying to project into the future, but if you allow that to permeate through all of your thinking, that's when you start getting screwed up. Because the idea would be the moment that those constants start to change, that you made this cool projection about, I'm the emperor of the earth, and this is what I need for that to happen. Then the moment one of those constants starts to change, then you attack it again.
That's that whole idea Alan Watts talks about, right? Where we mistake our systems for reality, our constructs of thinking for reality.
Sure.
I mean, time,
Yep. Well, I do think, sorry to cut you off. I was just going to say, I think it's really hard for humans to get out of the mode of thinking linearly, because our experience is so linear.
Totally. But that's where, for me, I argue that's why, I've even brought up Sean and I, thinking about different mythologies and different and science. Yeah.
Having a mythology that, gives you a view of the overarching nature of reality, which can be a corrective to your subjective experience.
Well, exactly. It's the corrective, right? It's the corrective to the subjective of you are trying to accomplish something, and for some reason you haven't thought about the rest of humanity. It's just it's self-centered. If you think of, if you only think linearly, you're thinking self-centeredly.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you think again of Native American thinking, sorry, did I cut you off?
No, I was just. I mean, how do you not think that way?
Yeah.
Because we're so tied to it.
Well, but that's a good question to ask, and I think people have been asking that for a long time. And you do that by having conversations with everyone else, because everyone else's linearity is different.
Well, but it's also so part and parcel of the system we exist in. When you think of, American civilization, for example, I mean, you're thinking linearly because you have this idea of self that you're trying to improve over time.
Right.
By gaining skills, or gaining knowledge, or gaining resources, or gaining status, and it's very self-centered. It's very accumulation to the self over time. Whereas I from what I know, a more Native American way of viewing things is to ground the self in nature, and in the oneness of things, and in the cycles of the natural world. And I think that balances out that human ego. And I think maybe the human ego was much healthier when it evolved because it existed within the context of that way of viewing things, of a nature-based reality.
Totally.
And that it is really our civilization that has made us sick.
Well, do you see, like, for me, it's like they're reciprocal because they, like, the idea would be...
As long as they're together, we've subtracted nature and doubled down with an ego construct around the ego.
Well, exactly, but yeah, I mean, the other has to be there for it to be reciprocal, right? So, but the idea would be that it's like you need the foundation of understanding your part in all of it, right? You need to understand all of it to know your part in it.
Vice versa.
Totally.
It seems like we went down a different path, like when we went from hunter-gatherer to civilization, when we started cooking our food, like those are all forks in the road that we went down, and we went down the civilization path. Like,
yeah, I mean, it was really agriculture that changed everything. But that was the beginning.
I would never say that culture is not able to live in the world of the cycles and stuff like that. It's arrogance that makes it think that we can live outside of the cycles.
Well, this is my view too, is that yes, that we can have a civilization that reincorporates that aspect that we've lost. But that would be seeing civilization itself as taking a cyclical view. So it's like it leaves nature, goes through this, and then comes back to nature. So, which is a way of thinking that's, come about a few different times. It's in anthropology. It's in the writing of Karl Marx, actually, talking about, primitive hunter-gatherer societies as kind of like primitive communism, and this idea that his whole intellectual exercise, trying to imagine an alternative to what we have now, is an idea of how do we get civilization back to the foundation of what we had when we were hunter-gatherers, that kind of like democratic, egalitarian way of living.
I mean, can we do that with also like going to Mars, traveling, like answering some of the more bigger questions that we want to answer about the universe? Because I feel like we went this path. If we stayed on the hunter-gatherer, we would have never gotten to where we are today.
See, but you're saying, do we have to keep on the line, as opposed to come full circle? But like, not full circle as in we go back to where we were, but like, do we regain what was lost, or is it just that, a straight line from hunter-gatherer out into the universe?
Right. Well, I do think that's an interesting point, though, because the way that we were thinking about things, the way that Native Americans were thinking about things. I mean, you can make a lot of cases for why the Native Americans weren't as advanced as the Europeans.
And many of them were environmental, but culture. Our culture is certainly more conducive to innovation. Definitely.
And so you wonder if the cultures were switched geographically, would would the Europeans still have been more advanced, although not as much because they wouldn't have had the economic advantages, but would they have been more advanced still in terms of technology than the Native Americans? And obviously that's a big what if that we can't really answer, but that type of ideology that the Native Americans had didn't necessarily incentivize that kind of development. Right. And so I think that's kind of what you were talking about, right?
Yeah, and I mean you can see what happened to them.
Yeah.
Well,
it wasn't evolutionarily a good way to go down. You have to keep moving forward. You have to keep...
Only because someone did it first.
Exactly. It's the same thing with the gun or the nuke or AI.
Well, and this is going to be a similar discussion to empire as well.
Yeah.
Can you stop having empires?
Well,
or is the fact that someone else is going to be an empire mean you have to be an empire first?
No, I think the only other solution is just having a one-world structure so you get past the point of... Because if you have all the individual...
that's the empire's goal.
Basically, yeah.
So now we're going to
That's the only...
world empire?
Well, not necessarily,
It eventually has to get there, I think.
Because we can talk about a one-world political infrastructure that still allows for the sovereignty of individual nations.
That's why I use the word structure
the
versus
United
government.
States of the Earth.
No. Because I would not want its federal government to be as strong as ours. I would want it to be in that analogy.
Yeah, no, that's
in a
not
global
gonna
structure. I want.
You're gonna say put more data into it and then have a less structured system for everything to work by.
Okay, no.
Not necessarily less
Your
structured.
idea of this being a country that functions together is our disagreement in the first place.
I see.
So I'm seeing this more of like something that allows nations to hold each other accountable politically in a way that no one can aggress against or interfere with another's internal processes. Do you see what I mean? So it's more...
I mean, I see what you mean. I can't conceptualize.
Right, so here's what I'm imagining, okay?
Okay.
Again, utopian.
Yeah.
So ideally, what I'm seeing is a world of democratically oriented states where each population has its own sovereign control over its territory to do within it what it wants.
Right.
Yet there's a charter for the rights of other states to not be interfered with by you, to not be aggressed against by you, maybe even rules about no standing armies, things like that. And where if nations begin to violate those things, the other nations group up to stop them, whether it be by physical means or by economic or diplomatic isolation, things like that.
So I have a question about that. What happens in that kind of environment when you have a country like Russia or China that are essentially dictators?
that's
big
the
bosses?
hardest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's I haven't really gone all the way through this. That's the goal, and I'd like us to discuss
Okay.
how it could be possible.
So one thing that I would
we
like...
do have to connect this too to the world we currently live in. How do we get from a world right now with big players
Okay, one thing
to
that I
a world
do...
where sovereignty exists?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, I think that's good to talk about. The one thing that I do want to point out, there's like two main ideas. There's also like just the philosophical idea of like trying to connect both the cyclical and the linear kind of perspective, the production kind of perspective. The other way of thinking about it is instead of cycles, it's like a spiral. So the idea would be that you spiral upwards by keep going and you keep having these patterns, but there is a progression.
And we've talked about this before.
So
You
there
cycle,
is that.
you go up a level. You cycle, you go up a level.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I do want to like that would be like the
Which
connection.
really, I mean, on the whole, that makes more sense with the whole idea of like the reconciliation of opposing forces anyway.
Exactly.
Yin yang, good, evil.
Exactly. And the thing that I would like to point out
Cycle
though
linear.
is all of the ideas that we're talking about are founded in the ideas that like started our Western like ways of thinking, which is a very progression based way of thinking.
Right.
And the problem with that is that we have like this implicit idea that progression's good. And if you have that idea, there's a lot of other things that are implicit with that, including empire. So one of the things that Harari points out is like a lot of people like to say like the military industrial complex is like one of it's military and empire, the two really big players, I guess, that you need a military for the empire to happen. But the thing that he points out is also how huge of an effect science had, which is like the fact that we even were able to become as big of an empire was because there were scientists who were like, okay, well, we're getting scurvy, so what are we getting, like, why are we getting scurvy? And the dude was like, well, let me try to figure it out. Here's some oranges, eat them along the way. Whoa, you're not getting scurvy. No idea why, but everyone do oranges now. And then they
let's
were
conquer
able...
the orange places.
Well, and then, like, there's, like, that was...
But it's all self-serving. I mean,
Well,
like,
totally.
self-reinforcing. Like, they wouldn't
But
need to
check
sail
this out.
those long distances if they weren't already conquering people.
Well, but do you see why the premise that progression is good
Right.
never changed?
Right.
That was there still, right?
Well, it's also kind of the scientific mindset of exploration.
Acquiring new knowledge, that was the other point. But
Because they weren't necessarily going there to conquer it, per se.
No, well, they were at first. But check this out. The cool thing is like, the scientists then started tagging along, and they were the ones who started to actually, like, care about wanting to, like, check out cultures and stuff just because they were nerding out.
Yeah.
They were just like, holy shit, these are new people.
Yeah.
And like there were like the biggest like change to it was when they went to, I'm pretty sure it was India, and there was like a few scientists who were really interested in language, and they like linguists, and they were I'm trying to remember, it's a really famous scratching kind of language.
Oh, Aryan script?
No, cuneiform. Yeah, it was cuneiform, but it did lead to the Aryan. That was led to that whole hypothesis of the Aryans. But yeah, cuneiform was like huge there, and so like they started to like basically change this culture. They needed to acquire knowledge from the locals to be able to find out where they could find out about cuneiform, and so the scientists started becoming diplomatic. And then they also started to learn more about the culture, and just through that, were able to communicate it to the people, like the more soldiery, kind of like militaristic leaders. And they found that it was way easier to conquer somewhere if you knew the people and you could get them on your side.
Oh,
And
yeah.
just, so it went from having, I know, right? But well, they didn't. They literally, like, before that, they were killing everyone, like, as possible. I mean, Alexander would be like a good, like, show of maybe that not being the case. But
he did both.
yeah, exactly.
But I mean, where his brilliance was knowing which one to use at which time.
Totally.
You know?
Well, and the other big argument that Harari had about why Alexander wasn't the quintessential, like, good empire builder, I guess, was because the biggest thing about learning about the culture was to be able to run the whole thing with a very small amount of people.
Right.
And that was like that. The only way you could do that is if you understood the culture well enough to be able to like get what you wanted, but to continue that culture happening as much as like was possible.
So they get what they want.
Exactly.
I think Alexander would have been great if he could have just stopped.
Yeah.
If I'm being honest, he never would have stopped. He would have kept going till he died.
Yeah.
Because I mean, next he was going. Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, next he was going to conquer Arabia, and then he was going to go up through Italy, conquer Italy, and then conquer Europe. That was his whole plan.
Good plan.
And he was. I mean, it seemed he was not going to stop to to centralize everything, to let it all settle down.
Yeah.
Well, so the reason why like I even brought all of this up was just because it seemed like when I heard Harari's like depiction of empire and creation of empire, I actually had I was less prone to think empire was a bad thing. So I thought that started making me think. Well, that started making me think.
You can see it in terms
it?
of like the forces that lead to empire happening, and that makes it make a lot more sense.
Mm-hmm.
When we think of empire as bad, it's usually from the point of view of the people outside, on the borders of empire, the people being subjugated by empire.
Totally.
And the human experiences that they're having.
Totally.
And the evils that empire creates.
Totally. And so I would agree with that, but that I think is more of a critique on empire, not so that you can get rid of it, but how you make it less prone to creating suffering.
Well, I disagree with that. I'm curious why you think that. Do you think empire has to exist, even though it naturally developed? It can't be overcome? Is that what you're saying? I'm not saying it didn't make sense for it to happen. I make perfect sense for it to happen.
Yeah.
But do you think it's something we could never overcome?
It's not that. I think there would literally have to be a paradigm shift for it.
I agree completely.
And
we've existed under the paradigm of empires for a long time.
That's just really hard to do.
Yeah, for sure.
So you gotta have a lot of evidence and shit, and when it comes to that, I think this kind of situation is just difficult because I feel like this, like the social sciences, is like one of the hardest places to have evidence for.
There's a few strong reasons for not wanting an empire.
Okay.
So first and foremost, historically, they're the number one cause of death to political liberty in the source country, of course, as well as the oppressed countries. Whether it's Athens, the Athenian Empire, the Roman Empire, the change of incentives from one to a nation state to a growing empire eventually requires the authoritarian crushing of political liberties in the home country.
Because, for like more stability.
Yeah, because it's worried about expanding and consolidating its power, and that inherently leads to the destruction of liberty-based forms of government.
Totally.
Whether they're democratic or Republican.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of makes sense.
So that's a huge thing. And then another issue is again, the massive suffering caused to the people on the ends of empire.
Right.
We already know that.
Right.
But the other thing is it causes a rapid increase in inequality, again, in the home country. And this was something Noam Chomsky did a good job elucidating, because it's a really rough study because there's so many variables, but this group of researchers in the UK tried to analyze the pros and cons, cost and benefit analysis of the English Empire.
Ooh, interesting. Look at that.
And they said straight up, the amount of variables are incalculable. We tried our best.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And at the end of their research, their results were that it generally was a wash. Like you're putting in about as much as you're getting.
Right, that was what I heard.
But the key change that happened was inside the country, it essentially acted as wealth redistribution upwards.
Interesting.
Which leads, again, to that development of crushing Republican and Democratic forms of government.
Totally.
Because it causes that inequality of wealth and power to grow,
Yeah.
which is unsustainable to a liberty-based political system.
It does also seem like it had the side effect of once the oppressed countries kind of shucked that oppression, they had been elevated in terms of technological improvement significantly more quickly than they would have been on their own.
I mean, if you're trying to spread it. I don't think that example holds for, say, the failed Middle Eastern states on the end of our empire right now.
That's true.
Also, there is plenty of just like, the problem is like the culture differences. Sometimes they don't want it.
Yeah.
There was literally like one of the examples was the English Empire, the British Empire, went and like took over an island, and people like just got so depressed that they had there were these new people who were like trying to change everything, that like everyone just actually like stopped eating and just were dying.
That happened also in some of the Caribbean islands. The Native Americans down there, they just stopped eating, and most of them wasted away.
Yeah,
I mean, you
trying to
can't-
say that Empire was good.
No. But I was just saying,
for sure, but that
it
doesn't
was-
always hold up. That's
part
the
of
thing.
it, he was.
But like,
even
I mean,
trying to
Alexander,
do the
for example,
technology.
spread Hellenic, technology and civilization all throughout, the Persian Empire. I mean, that was huge. A lot of that does happen. It
Yeah.
just doesn't always.
Yeah.
I'd have to look at each individual circumstance to really find out why it would in some cases and not others.
Yeah.
But at least in Alexander's sense, I think it was really easy for him to fill the shoes of the previous empire, because the Persians just treated him like the next god king.
Right.
It was easy for them to go, well, you're the new god king. We had a god king, you're the new god king. Which caused a lot of tension among the Greeks, because they didn't like the idea of a god king.
Right.
One of the things that I would find very interesting is like in social sciences, there's like it's pretty difficult to navigate like social sciences for many reasons, but one of them is also like, is there a type of government that functions well for everyone? Because the idea for me is that the empire wants to simplify or at least stabilize the inners, their inners, so that they can like be able to expand on their outers, where obviously a lot more adaptation is going to need to occur because there's new cultures trying to become incorporated into the empire.
See, but that's in late stage empire. That seems to be where they go wrong, is they forget about that internal stabilization.
Yeah.
To where I think it literally becomes cannibalistic, where it it's willing to consume its inner infrastructure in order to continue expanding outwards.
Right.
Which again, obviously, is the precursor to implosion.
Right. Yeah, but what I'm saying is like, that would be again another critique where we could make it better then, is to somehow be able to focus more on how to create more of a
This is a
stability.
tough discussion.
No,
Do you think it's possible to improve, or are those part and parcel to empire and it will always happen this way? And this is probably wrapped up in one of the core disagreements we usually have, which is the idea of concentrated power in general.
Yeah.
Which I always think devolves.
Yeah, I think it's inherently a system that's never going to be able. Like, there are pros and cons to an empire, but it's inherently you're pushing down people to elevate yourself, and it's going to turn on.
Well, I don't necessarily.
You can't
think that's
keep
true.
that. You can't keep that cycle.
Why
going.
do you think? Wait, what do you mean by you have to push people down? What is that like? Where is that?
So those who wish to exert control over their own circumstances, that you instead exert control over.
I mean, imagine China becoming an empire and taking over the United States. You think we wouldn't slowly try to rebuild and push them out?
That is
the thing.
I'm saying that's one.
What we
type
did
of
with the
empire,
British. I just don't. Yeah, empires.
I'm not saying they come in different. That's like saying a country would be the idea. With that for me, what that would be.
I think it really
Like, are all
is
countries? Sorry,
this
I
whole
know,
concentration of power thing.
Yeah.
Because once an empire exists, I think the mystique of that power, just the awe-inspiring nature of it, once it exists, it's going to draw the most venal types of people to oversee it, the most sociopathic, figures. I mean, I think someone like Dick Cheney is a perfect example of this kind of like corroding of the American empire into just kind of like this raw worship of power.
See, I would
and
probably
Trump speaks to that very bluntly.
Totally. Well, I'm definitely not going to look at the American empire and say that is what we want.
No. I'm just using an example though, because I do think that empires always happen this way. And the reason I think that is because it seems to, obviously we only have the examples that have happened so far, and that does always seem to happen. Not saying there's not some potential alternative.
Totally.
So it has happened that way in the past.
Totally.
And I just seems that power at that level always does that.
Yeah, the thing that I would say is that it seems that it's like the failing to adapt is going to be an issue. Because it's like, the idea would be that you can't it would be the idea that you can't only adapt to the external. You have to adapt to the internal too. Which I understand would obviously slow down the empire, right? That would be like one of the biggest things with that.
That's why we're at a big problem point right now, because we can't maintain the American empire's position globally, especially in the face of a rising competitor in China, and deal with what is now a very crumbling inner infrastructure for our own people.
Totally.
And those two things are going to come to a head. I mean, if we were going to really deal with the problems faced by the population in America, we're going to have to pull back the empire. We're going to have to pull back resources going towards that. And then we're going to lose more and more of our momentum in trying. We're already not going to keep up with China.
But doesn't that make... I think that makes both strategic and logical sense, though. Like, I understand that we would have to slow down the empire, but wouldn't that just, like, create a better, stronger America to be, like, to move forward in the future kind of idea?
See, it's hard because there's a lot of technical issues that were going to be argued against that. So, like, for example, so one of the things, one of the main things that gives us our power globally is, say, like, you know, the dollar being the world's reserve currency.
Right.
Or our, essentially, monopoly on diplomatic, you know, muscle.
Right.
And as we pull back to deal with our internal problems, and those voids are filled by other countries, we lose assets that will begin to be taken by other countries and then further their own growth and cause our own retraction to accelerate. So, you know, so like, say we lose the dollar as the world reserve currency.
Yeah.
When that happened to Britain, their economy
fucked up,
just took a nosedive.
But why are you using that as a premise?
Well, it's expected that that's going to happen within the next, like, foreseeable future.
But wouldn't that screw
the more
us?
influence we lose, the faster that'll happen.
So you're saying, but so you're saying our biggest influence is the military that we're using?
No, what I'm saying is, like, if we pull back from our empire to build up internally, that sounds like a good move from an imperial point of view, because if you have a stronger center, you're going to have a stronger empire.
Right.
However, we'll lose some of the things that are keeping our empire afloat by pulling back. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I get that.
And we might not be able to retain
This sounds like an individual who's in a precarious place where they have to change because they know something bad's happening, and then they're just worried about changing, and so they're going to keep doing what they're going to do even though they need to change. That's what that just sounds like to me, right?
Yeah, in a sense. I guess my core point of view with this is that all empires end, and there will always be new empires that try to take their place.
Yeah.
And if we decide that that phenomena is more negative than positive, then what kind of global infrastructure could we create to stop empires from arising in the first place?
And that's what I want to talk about, because I think that is the conclusion that I've come to, is empires are inherently they're wrong, and we need to create some kind of structure. And a good way to do that is we are an empire, so we can step down and create that structure from our elevated position.
And it would have to, I agree with
because that's the only positive way we're going to... Other than that, I think we're going to crash and crumble.
Yeah.
Because empires, especially with today where we have nukes and we have the capability of destroying our environment, we just can't afford it anymore. Something's going to happen, if it's not us, then China's going to become the next global empire, and
Well, they're thinking right now that while China's going to be the biggest one, that after the United States, it's probably going to go to a multipolar world again, where you have spheres of influence by big players rather than one central player. The idea being that the United States has shown that maintaining global dominance is very unsustainable, whereas empire is always unsustainable. That's very unsustainable. We have the biggest, most powerful empire in history, and it's going to be the shortest lived.
And then
if you think about it, we built our empire 50 years ago, and now we're seeing its death knells. So
well, and we talked about how military is tied to an empire. You have to have one for the other. So I think we need to do something like Japan, where just having an army to defend your homeland, and then have a standing army for the world that goes around, and we set morals and standards that each country, they can do whatever they want, as long as they don't
global constitution essentially.
But a very, very light one, like
Like
so
the
you
UN.
can still do
No, but not the UN, because it has no power.
Okay, but more power
to enforce it. Yeah,
I feel like the UN
pretty much
was
a powerful
idealized, but never really worked out.
essentially a powerful UN that's focused on the individual sovereignty of nations and the non-interference of nations in other nations.
But that's the thing, all the big players
And
have to
non-aggression.
agree to downsize their military and send
Or have no
funds to
standing
one.
military, and to send
Well, I think you
what
need to
used to
have a
be-
military. I think each country needs
Something small.
Military, but there needs to be some world military.
I'm worried about like the system that would be like providing these soldiers, these world soldiers, like who's gonna be
it's sticky. Let's
in
not
charge
pretend
of
these
all
are easy
that.
questions.
Yeah.
But that's the thing, you have to talk about it because the American Empire, it's leading to what we've seen in past empires, and it's not going to be pretty when it crumbles.
Can we say that we're just gonna go into thought experiment mode
Let's do it.
at this point? Because it's like I feel as though it's gonna be really hard to realistically think about this. So if we can somehow, this would be like we're gonna create the ideal, and then we can try to figure out how the fuck to get there.
I suppose, yeah.
I think
Although I don't
that's-
think the idea of like creating a global movement, an anti-imperialist global movement for like a stronger UN or something of the like is that far-fetched. I mean, it would be tough as fuck because you're going against the nations that want to maintain their
I think it would just be,
individual
even in America, it would be
power.
difficult
Yeah.
because of the
Everyone would
establishment that's in place now.
I think inevitably we have to come
See,
together.
but that's the thing too. It's
We
like,
have
do you want forces under the command of this United Nations entity, or is it like the United Nations thing says, okay, we're going to do this mission, and then nations send their own troops for a joint operation at that time?
Yeah, that one's really hard because.
But the UN does have troops right
There's
now.
a lot of
The
scary.
UN has troops.
It's definitely a
helmets.
difficult thing to do, and I think it's also interesting. Even if we could somehow set up a global government that has this kind of directive of
Live and let live.
at what point do you break that, right? So we have like Russia and China, big dictatorships. Like, is that okay? They're completely oppressing their people. They don't let them have freedom of information and all these things that most most people in this quote unquote civilized world would consider basic rights, right? And then what happens if some African country just decides to start killing their people? Like,
See,
do we
that's
just
really,
say,
really tough because, like, my ideal in this scenario is that each country has the right to self-determination among its own people. So some form of democratic something, so then it's like, if one starts becoming authoritarian or a tyrant takes over, do you go in?
Well, we just don't have that already.
But
we don't
that's-
have.
Or do you
Russia's
say
not
no?
Russia is
Well, there's
democratic.
It's not like we are, but
Yeah, right. That's
Um,
what I'm saying. It's like the
but
base from where
so
we're working at is bad.
and then it's like, okay, well then do you say, even if it's a horrible country, do you leave it alone as long as it stays within its borders and just apply pressure to try and change the situation without physically intervening? And I think that might be a safer way to do it in the long run because it's going to suck for sure to see that happen. But at the same time, if you have the context where you can go in and intervene, then I think there's the chance for that to be abused, which undermines. It very much would then at that point undermine the faith in that institution. It's like the United States. I mean, the United States essentially acts as, you know, the face of NATO and the UN and these global institutions, and yet because we've used that to intervene for purely self-gain and political purposes, all of these global institutions, people have lost faith in them. They don't hold sway in a lot of parts of the world because they're seen as a farce for U.S. power.
And that's what they are.
Yeah, it's tough because I feel like when you have actual genocide going on in another country, it's hard to just be like, well, they haven't done anything to their other country nearby, so we'll just let it happen. You know,
I mean,
it's
I
like
think you'd have to
hundreds of
apply
thousands of people dying, but whatever.
really hardcore measures just shy of.
Also,
But
just
then you still have some sort of criteria that has to be made for that. You know?
Yeah.
well,
It's
maybe
kinda
there's
the same
different
problem,
levels.
It's
you know?
tough.
Maybe there's different levels for different types of intervention.
It's tough, and maybe we can't set these rules sitting on a couch. Maybe
Yeah.
maybe we have to set a criteria where countries send representatives to vote on the measures.
Oh, I mean, it would have to be that.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, I think that would be.
And so it's now just kind of like a larger constitutional democracy to provide loose rules over the sovereign interaction of sovereign
That's why I'm
nations.
just worried that it's gonna be like an empire.
Well, as long as it's not a centralized government, and as long as it's more just kind of like a referee on the interactions of countries,
Mhm.
then I don't think that's the case.
Okay. I mean, I could dig that.
And certainly moving in that direction, I think, would be better than the raw imperialism we have now. You know, I mean, it's not even. It's just blatant.
I just feel like I don't even necessarily like. It would be interesting to see what systems need to be put in place in order to like be able to supply that standing army.
Yeah.
Or should you even have it?
Yeah.
That's the
No.
most
Well, the
complex.
one, the policing one.
Well, right, but we were saying, you know, you could either have a standing one, or you could have it where it's like, you know, they conscript forces from member states at times where they're needed.
I'm just imagining what happens when now militaries are different and they're all taught differently.
Yeah, trying to work together.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that sounds like a shit show. That sounds like every commander would be so upset.
See, that'd be interesting. too, 'cause then what if you had like mutually agreed upon like basic
Ways to
framework
do.
for like, okay, now we're going to train you about how we act when we're working in a United Nations operation. You know, so it's like a separate structure that you're also trained for.
God, that sounds. It's like
Yeah.
we're better, but we'll train you how to be worse in this situation.
Well, it's not better or worse. It's, you know,
They're gonna
here is
think
our
that.
own nations, and then here's the collective.
Yeah, which one do you think they're gonna think is better?
That's fine if they think it's better, as long as they don't fuck up when they work together.
Well, then are they supposed to like help improve the? I mean, okay. Well, I guess this is the whole idea about competition. I guess they could be like, if they have that democratic vote thing, they could say
Yeah.
like, well, we have a military. We're going to talk about military. We think this one's better, and we'll show you how. We'll show you the statistics.
Yeah,
based
vote on the
that.
measures, the collective measures.
How you train.
Yeah, it'll be interesting.
That's really. I mean, it is super. That's super interesting because it's also like it would be kind of like an in between. It would be like a diplomatic group that would be like an in between of what everyone thinks is best for a country. If they're all voting on it.
Very tricky.
See, but it would have to be one. Like, how do you do the voting then? One country, one vote. You know, should
Should we
You
have a Senate
can't
and a House?
because
should Haiti have one vote?
no, I mean
China's one vote.
that's why the biggest.
I think it. Honestly, I think it should.
You
I think
do?
one vote. I do. I know that seems sketchy to the. But that's the thing is, it seems sketchy to those who wish to use their power. to
Yeah,
their
no.
advantage.
I definitely think
But
it should be
then-
one.
I think if it's going to be genuinely respecting
I can't see that
the
working.
rights of individual countries, it would have to be that kind of equal.
Yeah, but
setting.
it's like, I feel like it's also like,
Do you
because
think
some
this-
countries only have like 1 million people. Like, there's really small countries, and you're saying that those 1 million people have
I'm not
as
stuck
much
with
of a
this idea.
voice.
So what we're
as
gonna do is we're gonna create an electoral college.
hundreds
For
and hundreds of
Oh,
millions.
God.
okay.
Yeah, they don't.
All right, let me just say this is a really sticky, complicated issue, but
Yeah,
I do think answers are out there.
Okay.
If we can all sit down on a couch and come up with something that sounds better than what we have right now already, we could do better, people.
It's fair. There's definitely room for improvement. That's for sure.
And I think
it's definitely hard though.
I think it's weird. I guess like one of the biggest things is like we're trying to like decrease the amount of suffering, and we're trying to decrease the amount of like intervention, and also give more liberty to places,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So like the idea for me that's like such a bummer is it doesn't seem as though we really like commend those who get into like diplomatic roles between countries. Like for some reason that's not like one of the highest freaking like positions.
Yeah, well, that would mean we would have like our ideals would be based around diplomatic relation.
Well, wouldn't that be necessary for this to even occur?
Yes, but that's part of a paradigm shift that would have to take place.
Totally.
Where we're, calling out the injustices of empire, saying that this can't continue, and a movement towards some kind of more collective.
I even think it could work within the framework that we have now to say
Go ahead.
diplomatic. Well, just to say that diplomacy is more important than military.
Right.
Without, I think that could work within empire too.
But it goes back to like North Korea and like even like China and Russia, or like, yeah, some people are just like, no, fuck off. This
Well,
is
we
our
need
country.
those
Well, I'm
people
sure
to
even if
do
you
what we
make
want.
this for a time, there will be a lot of countries that aren't part of it.
Exactly.
But
That's what I was
what will be important is the countries that are part of it still abide by their own rules, even when dealing with countries that aren't. So it's like you're not going to intervene in a country just because they're not part of your pact. You're going to say, no, we're not going to intervene. But if you attack one of our people, we'll stop you.
Totally.
Yeah, that's the most realistic.
Yeah. And if faith in that institution grows due to it faithfully executing its stated ideals, then I think more and more would join it.
Isn't that one of the big things too?
Yeah.
It actually, that I think is actually one of the biggest things that I would see is the problem with our empire right now is how fucking just
Well,
they just don't actually tell the truth.
that's
They're
the
not
whole thing, man.
honest.
I mean,
you
I've
know?
never, I don't know if a system not based off concentration of power into the hands of a small group as possible and empire can be separated. Because that's kind of what empire is. It's like the attempt to accumulate as much power as you can into the hands of one governmental institution.
Wouldn't it?
Or governmental entity.
But I get that. It would, but for me, it would
Or as
also
many
be
people as possible.
because power is just a tool. Do you see how like that? If that is your premise, then yeah, dude, anything's on the line. You can do anything as long as you're just aiming for power. You just need to be able to have the most
for
power.
power's sake.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas this would be you have to define what it is that you need, and then if power needs to be there for it, then there you are, But at least it's constrained by those kind of ethics that we were talking about with our
It's
whole
usually
AI
used
thing too.
to make you rich as well. But
Right. Which is also nice. But no, I mean that's the type of power, right?
that's what. So like Lawrence Wilkerson, you guys all know him, but for those listening, he was Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He used to work for both under Colin Powell as his chief of staff, and then I think he worked in the Reagan administration too. But anyway, he's out now as like a whistleblower against American empire and the unsustainability of American foreign policy. And he said the two main things in his estimation that drives American empire's way of thinking is first what extends its power, and second what makes it rich. And those are its two primary orientations.
Right. Which seems like, it seems as though it's that like kind of the dogmatic follower who has forgotten why they're doing what they're doing, and they just continue to do it.
The U.S.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
But
right?
that seems like what always happens in empire. It's like first it's empire with a purpose, and then it becomes empire for empire's sake.
Yeah, I mean, I can't disagree with you because that's like historically correct, but it's just like it's that I guess I find that more of an issue that we can remedy. I don't think that that's something that's
Yeah. I mean, what do you think? Because we're always gonna have the same position, which is
Yeah.
that Drew says we can use this power for good purposes. And I say the very fact that that power exists in such a concentrated place means it will eventually degenerate or corrupt.
I tend to agree with you more on that, to be honest. I mean, I definitely agree that it's possible that the power can be used for good. You know, you look at lots of
And it certainly can,
empires in the
especially
past.
it is on a temporary basis.
Yeah.
You know, whether it's like a certain movement or a leader that comes forth with a vision of how to use this power to benefit people.
Totally.
But in my estimation, that always seems to be the exception rather than the rule.
Yeah.
And generally, it's undone afterwards.
Yeah, and that's the biggest problem is that when you have that much power, all it takes is like one bad seed, basically, and it goes to shit.
Totally. But I would say that
And
might
the bad
just be.
seeds are going to be drawn to it.
But wouldn't we say that that's kind of what the forefathers of America thought when they put in the term limits for stuff? Obviously not for presidency, but because they didn't have that yet. But for, I guess they did for term limits, but not the number of terms you could have. But yeah, like the limiting of time that you could hold your position. Wouldn't that be a way to try and make it so that the kind of power wasn't held within a concentrated? It was held within a concentrated place, but the people who had that power moved through it.
Yeah, but I mean, the founding fathers also were very sketched out about the idea of the power of government growing as well. Just like its latent power potential.
Totally.
That also was a thing of concern, not just how long someone wielded it. But I do agree with you, the longer someone is in a position of power, the more corrupted they will become. No matter how good they are, in my view.
And both you and you think the forefathers thought that the structure was an issue?
What do you mean by structure?
Because I'm trying to figure out, because the power is held by someone.
Right.
Is there like a power that's just like, would it be like a natural power would be kind of the idea that you're like thinking about? Where
what
it's
I'm thinking about is just, there's a lot of different points where the founding fathers wrote about the danger of the government growing too powerful. More powerful.
And what were the reasonings for that?
I mean, I'd have to go and look at it. But just coming out of my idea of the general arguments of the time also, with the Enlightenment and all that, I mean, they were looking at Rome a lot. And seeing how, as Rome got more powerful, it made them lose their republic as it became an empire. And they were looking at very similar stuff to the kinds of things I'm arguing.
More government is less liberty, kind of
essentially.
And I think the part that I always hesitate with that is I feel like liberty is limitless. It's that the government takes away some things that you can do, and then you have all of everything else to work with. It just depends on what we want to do. That's freedom is you're born into this world, and obviously you have the constraints of physics, but then the rest is all based on social constructs.
Right.
So that's going to be government, as well as,
culture. Economy, everything.
So, but that's going to, impede your freedom, right? And so that would be what the government would be. That's in my head, that's what the government does. So you can do all of literally everything except these things that we've all decided is better or have discovered is better based on this evidence and stuff like that. So any laws that would take away a liberty would be because it was necessary for whatever premise you held before.
Yeah, I mean, if the government was somehow doing its due diligence in the name of liberty.
Yeah, I mean, you could just look at net neutrality as a kind of a counterpoint to that.
Right.
Or mass surveillance.
Yeah, that's taking away liberty that we didn't want them to take away, but they did it anyway because they have too much power. We can't stop it.
True, but I also that's a collection of different powers working together.
See, but that's
not even a concentration of power in one place. It's a concentration of power in multiple places.
It becomes it. I mean, to say that there hasn't been a fusion of corporate and government power, I think would be pretty naive. I mean, there's a lot. These people cycle through these institutions and go to dinner together and talk about it together. And
the difficulty is there's always a little bit of restraint because of people who have. It's the idea is that they can't really get around so much that everyone would start being okay, you guys obviously aren't doing the thing that you're saying you're doing, so we're going to get rid of you.
Oh, it's definitely there. I think people just don't think
some
they could
people,
get rid of them.
Some people think
Dude,
that.
I mean, Congress approval rating is 12%. The number one issue, statistically,
12%.
yeah, the number one
Dang.
issue for the American people
Maybe I'm
is
just
corruption in government. That's the highest, like across the base issue.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Even for their own state. Or
Well,
is
no,
this
it's
the kind of
federal government.
idea?
It's federal. It's like
This is the idea where it's like, oh, we're okay, but everywhere else isn't okay.
no. What do you mean?
Because obviously, like, if it's 12%, like, where's the 12? Where are you locating that 12?
What's the exact number, Dwight?
Looks like it was. Well, hold on. Let me sort through it a little bit. Go ahead. Keep talking.
Okay. Anyway.
It's more just based on the idea of, like, okay, well, if everyone thinks
Well, it makes perfect sense when you look at that. You know, that paper that was done that showed that 70% of Americans have no influence on policy. You know, I mean, the people know that the government's not responding to them, that their interests aren't being, you know, taken care of.
even at the state level and the local
This was
level.
about federal Congress.
Okay, but we also do elect those people in our state.
You mean like the senator that's going to go?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this was just about Congress overall.
I know, so that's what I mean is, like, the idea
Oh,
is...
so you're wondering, was their approval rating just as low for their own
Yeah,
representative?
exactly.
No, it's actually very high.
Exactly. So
So-
they're basically like everywhere else has a problem, but we don't have a problem.
Well, yeah. And so I think a lot of it is, you know, people. I think a lot of it is people who understand things aren't working, yet have been persuaded by the political maneuvering of their own representatives.
Totally.
You know, so they don't
No, I mean,
understand the connection
Yeah.
between their representative and the institution that doesn't work for
And
them.
I could totally see that being pretty easy if people just don't look at the Senate. Like, they pay attention to all the stuff that they're voting for in their state,
Well,
but then
it's-
don't outside of it.
It's also how, you know, how susceptible people are to tribalism.
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
that tribalism has been utilized so effectively in our age.
Yeah.
You know, it's so rabid, one side against the other.
Mhm.
And if they could reorientate themselves to understand that the whole American populace is in a consensus that the Congress doesn't work for us,
Mhm.
and dealt with that as a systemic issue
Yeah.
instead of a, if only my team was in power.
Right.
Well, when any team gets in power on either side, everyone still hates everything. So.
Right. Right. Right.
As of September 2018, it was 19%.
Oh,
Nice.
snap.
Just an F minus minus minus.
That's from Statista.com.
We have a fifth of the country's okay.
76% disapprove. So,
Yeah,
few people that
There's some
don't
in
know about
between.
And
Yeah.
weird. What was that? 70% of people have no say over.
76% disapprove.
And then
No, well,
the other
and then
ones.
there's that study saying that 70% of Americans have no say over policy. So, almost the same number.
And they, how did they? Do you know how they said that was like?
So the way they did it was they did like a broad statistical analysis
Mhm.
of the positions held by the American people.
Okay.
And then they compared that to policy.
Okay.
And then they did the same thing but separated by wealth.
Okay.
And so the higher your wealth went, the closer the correlation to policy. And when you got to the upper echelons of wealth, it was almost exact.
Totally. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that one's super hard too because that is just I feel like the remnants of the like how government and capitalism will work together. Because the
I
idea,
agree.
the whole the premise would be like the person who is like getting the most money is also giving the most too. That's why they're getting the most, right?
If that happened.
I mean, but that's like the idea, and so they obviously have the best idea of what should happen in the government, so they should have the most say, right?
Yeah, but that's just blatantly not democracy.
No,
and it's
it's
not a
plutocracy. I mean,
republic.
it's plutocracy,
It's not a
right?
republic either. So any common American who isn't just like a wealth groveler would be completely opposed to that.
It's just odd how when you line it up like that, how do people really think that like capitalism would be okay with democracy?
I mean,
They have different ideals.
there's
in
been
mind.
more work put into that propaganda than any other in this country.
Yeah.
So people equate capitalism with freedom. They see authoritarianism as linked to anti-capitalism. You know, I mean, there's a lot of confusion to deal with, but It's getting better. I mean, the newest polls were showing that now a majority of millennials on the left-wing millennials, and again, we should note that majority of millennials are left-wing. So more than 50% of them would prefer socialism to capitalism now. Not that they understand what that means.
Yeah, no, I mean, right.
But the souring on the idea that capitalism is the answer is a positive development.
Totally. And at least maybe that might open their minds. I hope they go further than that.
Yeah, I mean, I was also one of those people at one point who just said, I don't think this is right. I think it's something else. And now here we are talking about democratic cooperatives and the ending of empire. So hopefully people keep digging.
Totally.
Hopefully.
Because again, I don't want to throw...
There's just so many distractions that
That's the game.
that's the problem. It's so easy to... I mean, we just got distracted last night with the UFC. It's just a dumb fight of two people. It's like...
Not that all distractions are bad.
Yeah.
It's like, if you don't ever pay attention to other shit, then yeah.
There's just two egos fighting each other. There was no real, like...
That's certainly true.
Critique of UFC.
Anyway, so are we going to cover free will while we're here? That's one thing we haven't gotten into.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean,
Why don't you open
Yeah, open it up, Sean.
Is
Get in
this
there.
conversation, do we have free will in this whole conversation, or is this all just a part of the plan? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think we do have free will. But then again, I don't know if it really matters if we do or don't. I don't know if it would change our life. Or should it change the way you live your life? It's like the Marcus Aurelius quote, like, it doesn't matter if there's a God or if there isn't. You still be a good person. You still have morals. You still live your life to that standard. And, yeah, if there's a God or if there isn't, they're still going to respect you and...
Or not.
Or not, yeah.
Fuck them. I don't know. You go, Dwight.
I tend to think that there isn't free will. I don't think there's no scientific evidence that there's free will, right? Like the only thing that's in our heads is molecules, and we don't know of anything that can influence those other than the stuff that we know about. And so there's nothing that says that there should be free will that we know of yet, which obviously doesn't mean that there isn't. It just means that I'm skeptical. You know, it's kind of in the same light that I see some sort of supernatural being, right? I don't think there's any evidence
what is free will to you? What does the idea of free will mean to you?
That we can make decisions based on something aside from just the chemical reactions in our brain. So I tend to think of it in terms of like, if we had a powerful enough supercomputer and we knew enough about the universe and like everything, that we could put in all these variables and we could model the universe perfectly, that we could then predict what every person is going to do. I think if we had a crazy, absurdly powerful supercomputer and we knew all these variables, that we could do that. So to me, what that says is that there's nothing outside of the chemical interactions in your brain that's going to determine what's going to happen. So like me saying, oh, I'm going to get up and go get a glass of water is not like something in me deciding to do that. It's that was going to happen anyway, and based on the environmental impacts and everything that's happened before in my life and everything that's happening now right here. So it's not necessarily that there's like some sort of decision being made per se. It's more just that it was going to happen. And so that's sort of my scientific viewpoint on whether or not there's free will. But I do psychologically still think of myself as being able to make decisions, because I think it would be hugely damaging for me to not think that, and to think that like I can't actually do anything. Like,
so you believe that there isn't, but then you kind of believe, but you act as if there is.
Correct.
Pragmatism.
Because like I'm not so arrogant as to assume that I'm right. Like I don't know if there is or isn't, but what I do know is that if I were to believe that there wasn't and act as if there wasn't, then it might damage the way that I live my life. And so I'm going to pretend that there is, even though I don't necessarily believe that there is, because that makes me happier.
Interesting. I mean, yeah, I understand where you're coming from. For sure. I mean, I definitely do believe in free will, even though I understand all of those arguments. And I could be completely wrong, but the way I see the universe taking into account the idea of free will is that we could have predicted everything, like you said, from the Big Bang up till the point where you have, sentience. And at that point, there's new variables.
That's just for the podcast is determinism.
Oh, that's a thing? Determinism?
Yeah.
All right, well, I'm a determinist. But anyway, yeah.
But isn't it?
No, it continues. Like,
Yeah.
no, not up until a certain point.
Yeah,
determinism is you can determine.
So you're a determinist
everything.
until humans come about, or
Yeah.
until something sentient.
Which is
at
really
a
interesting.
level of
It's
sentience.
an interesting caveat you got there, Dan.
Yeah.
That's what I thought
Well,
for a long time. Is
yeah.
that a thing
And
that
that's
you know
that's
of?
his argument for free will is that everything is deterministic until humans or some sentience comes about.
Right.
At which point we can no longer predict because of this other worldly thing of free will.
And I don't think it's otherworldly. I think it's a construct
Okay.
that within it grants the capacity for self-determination.
See, that's
So
what
it's
I
like
believe
it
too.
has these chemical things going on,
Mm-hmm.
but there's some core reasoning entity in the middle of that is a part and parcel of that construct. I don't think it's supernatural in any way, but that it can select between these different vying forces.
Totally. That's
And
known as the Cartesian theater. So that's the idea that there is something that is watching everything occur, like that is separate from it. And then you're just like having all of the determinism happening, but then you can like poke on it. You get to like poke.
That's a lot closer to what I think, for sure. And to get more into the minutia of it, I tend to think that most people, most of the time, are not exerting any free will. That they respond directly to these stimuli, just like you're saying. But that that if one tries hard enough and applies oneself to it, you can budge it a little. You can choose, no, I don't want to do what I was gonna do. I want to shake it up and do this thing instead. And so, yeah, and it gets more into like also, when human beings are in states of necessity, when they're compelled by their circumstances to do things, and they don't have the luxury and the security to exert their free will, then I don't think they have free will in those moments, because they're just responding to stimuli. So I think we tend to be like, maybe 90-something% non-free and a little bit free.
Where would you say that thing is like located, and what do you think it is?
I don't know.
Okay.
To either of those questions. I think it is somehow created as a byproduct of the total composition of what we are, and I don't know.
So one of the ideas is
consciousness itself is incredibly we
don't
know about the stomach brain now and how that's a thing, and like there's all kinds
even
of
with
shit.
that we still don't
So I don't know. This is largely just my own introspection, an intuitive view of things.
No, that's good. I mean, a lot of people, that's pretty like close to a lot of the stuff that's like talked about nowadays.
You should talk about what you think too.
Yeah, I'd totally be down. The one thing that gets difficult though with that, Dan, is like, okay, so first it's like there's the idea that consciousness would be an epiphenomena of the neurons that are firing in your brain. Okay, so it's like there's like kind of basically the static on top of like the energetic static on top of like the brain tissue, and that is like what consciousness is. And some people advocate for that. And that could be a place for what you're talking about. Because you said it wasn't otherworldly, right?
I don't think so.
Okay.
But again, we can't claim that with surety. I tend not to believe in otherworldly forces generally.
Totally. And it's just...
in my own personal spiritual way I do, but I don't literally think they exist.
Totally. And those, like, the spiritually way could be argued as, like, mental tools for you to use rather than...
Right.
Because there are, like, we don't want to throw out the theories that would be there is a soul, because that's a place for that. That what you just described is a place for a soul.
See,
like, a soul could be there.
I don't believe in a soul in the way it's talked about in, like, Christianity or anything, though.
Yeah.
But if you want to call, like, a physical phenomena the soul, and say that it's simply something we don't understand yet.
Totally. What about... Okay, but you do think it's a physical phenomenon. So you think that it's working within the materialistic standpoint?
I think so, only because we haven't learned anything other than that. So
I don't think we have a soul. I think we're. Yeah, I don't think there's much difference between us and an animal, or any other life, but we do have our critical brain that we can use tools like logic and reasoning to do what we're doing right now, having a conversation, which leads to free will. I think that's why more simple life forms don't, because it literally is just a chemical
slave to
going
stimuli,
on.
essentially.
Well,
But then that's the
please.
argument, like, maybe everything going on right now is just chemicals. I mean, it is just chemicals bouncing off of each other.
But the question is, has it reached a state of complexity where it has
Where we
an
have
autonomous entity or construct within it as a product of it?
The way that I think about it is that there's this idea in like cognition research or cognitive research that there's these things called metacognitions. And the idea would be that you have processes, because like a huge thing in cognition research is to imagine the brain as basically like a computer. So the idea would be is that you have processes that are watching other processes. So the idea would be like you're trying to like remember a word, and so you count the amount of times you hear that word every day. That would be like, there's obviously a ton of other functioning that's going on, but the idea of you trying to remember and recall the number of times, that's like a metacognition for something. So for me, that's how I think of free will, is like a space where I think meditation is like one of the best examples for it, is like where you can watch what's going on at different parts of the brain. So other different processes. So like your heart beating, or like you breathing, or like that would be like way lower brainstem kind of stuff. Or like you could go to the limbic system, like what am I feeling? What is like going on that way? And then you can also think about what are like a higher kind of like what's on my mind, kind of idea. And there's always that thing about it where it's like, okay, well, you're watching those things, so the thing that's watching it seems to be apart from all of that, a different thing from all of that, because it's the thing watching all of that stuff happening. And a lot of people will, like, for meditation, will keep taking that up and up and up and up, and then that's where they get like to this idea that there may be something that watches everything else.
Right.
But the other idea for that philosophically is there's no end to it. Like, you can keep going up.
Forever.
Yeah.
Right.
And so the way that I think about it functionally is like free will functionally is, because I don't think that there is like this thing where you are free to do whatever the fuck you want. I don't think that's real.
No. And kind of like what I was saying, I think there's like a limited amount of freedom in a largely unfree context.
Totally. So the way that I think about it is, why I say functionally is because we do make decisions and we make choices, and so we have to be able to explain that somehow. Like the idea that we feel as though we make a choice is something, even though we have proven through neuroscience that there's actually the decision to do the action. The feeling happens after, when it was already done. So it's like when you decide something, quote unquote decide something, when you're like, I decide I'm gonna choose Pepsi, like from earlier, that already happened before you said I'm going to decide it in your head. So the idea, if you think that's the free will part, that I don't think is the free will part. But there is also this idea that you can select your environment for the kind of things that will come into your mind.
Yeah, and that's part of why I think of it in terms of like, we're largely products of our stimuli, and we have kind of an ability to nudge things.
Yeah.
So that idea of like, I'm going to change my environment because I know that's going to change me.
Yeah.
You're making a choice that's going to impact, your future behavior. I mean, even if you couldn't do it without the assistance of the stimuli, to me that indicates there's still something there, outside the stimuli.
But I would say that is predicated on other stimuli.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so it could just be, you came across the stimuli of knowing that you're changing your environment would change who you are, and thus you change your environment in a way that you were already going to do in those kinds of ways. Like, it's it gets difficult because, when you're talking about something that watches the other thing, it's like all of that's still up in here. All of that is still constrained by what's going on in our minds or bodies, wherever it may be. And so to say that it has some sort of control or autonomy, I feel is sort of a misnomer. And it's basically, maybe we don't understand it and we're not cognizant of what's actually going on.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that it's not self-determined already. That it's
That's
not
true.
just a bunch of
That's
chemical
true.
reactions that are going on and all of a sudden, oh, I've decided to do this thing.
Yeah.
And it's
However, the fact that you say complexity, that I can 1 gajillion % agree with. We don't
super
know.
complex for sure.
Yeah, we know barely
I
anything
know.
about how neuron firing actually becomes a thought.
Yeah.
We don't. Yeah. But the we can get regions of a brain that might be for this kind of thing. That's like basically where we're at.
Right.
Um,
And again, I think it's really important to think of yourself as having agency over your life. I feel like that's
Well,
such a
statistically, that literally does impact your life,
it's such a
Exactly.
whether you
huge
believe it or not.
exactly.
idea, yeah. And so when that's why I say that I can't defend the premise of free will from a scientific standpoint, but I still believe that I have it because I feel like it's beneficial for me.
And that's why I advocate for a redefining of what free will is. I don't want to get rid of the concept of free will, but I want to make it workable within
See, I
science.
agree, and I actually tie that into some of my political views in the sense of talking about what environmental factors deny one's capacity to exert control over their own life.
Yeah.
I mean, and that again was talked about a lot during the New Deal by FDR. The idea necessitous men are not free men.
Totally. And
You
even
know?
from so there, that's it for a social aspect, but we were just speaking about it in an individual aspect where speaking about how cognition researchers have looked at situations where they're trying to obtain material from a witness,
Yeah.
and how easily you can embed false memories or channel someone's thoughts, and literally you can be this person and show that person enough to them where they will take that person's face and they will remember that being the person. It's a completely different person. You can insert that memory and they won't know the difference. So there's situations where that can happen too. Where you take away the free will of even recall, even your own memory.
Yeah.
So
I think memory is something we habitually trust far more than it deserves.
Oh,
it's incredibly faulty. Yeah.
It's one of those things that we hold so dear to ourselves and we think of as so infallible in so many instances, and yet it's
Well, we would have no concept of self without memory.
Mhm.
It really is the seat of our identity in a lot of
Totally.
ways.
Don't they say all memory is just every time you remember something, you're just remembering the last time you remembered it? So
Yeah,
it's
well,
a
because
copy of
the
it.
act
copy
of
of a
remembering
copy.
something
Yeah.
is you literally rewriting the entire occurrence, and so every time you remember something, you're actually rewriting it and therefore changing that.
Yeah, it's like telephone around a camp.
Yeah.
yeah, I mean it is really cool thinking about it from a neuron standpoint too, because it's literally if you have something that gets triggered, it's basically you have this line of 4 different neurons and it will shoot up that line, but those neurons are in a chemical soup, and that chemical soup will be a little bit different because you're in this mood or in this mood or in this mood, or you remembered this thing. And so what happens is your neurons will actually grow differently each time and maybe
Only those
connect
4,
with
though.
another. Yeah, only those 4. In this case, we're looking at a small
Yeah.
system. But they will literally grow differently now. Some won't because they're so freaking embedded, really deep down. But more of our, our memory stuff, the hippocampus is made to do that, and that's really what a huge part of what we use for recall is taking all of this information and trying to group it up into it so that we can use it for prefrontal cortex.
Yeah.
And that changes all the time. So.
Which is fucking insane. To think about, just for me, one of the kind of the same cognitive dissonance that I have for memory or for free will rather, and how I actually believe it works. It's hard for me to get around that when I'm thinking of things like how memory works or how the immune system works. Those things are so fucking insanely complex, and it's just crazy for me to think about how that just evolved and how we can, I could think back to a time, 10 years ago, and I can essentially replay what I think happened and sort of watch it as a movie in my head, and what the, that's insane. So just that's kind of an aside, but holy fuck, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
kidding.
But existence.
Holy
Life's
fuck,
a
it
trip,
is
boys.
reality.
But I think like one of the reasons why I got really interested in cognition research is because of that idea of like the metacognitions, because I think they're so useful for people, especially when it comes to like moral situations or like trying to change behavior.
Yeah.
Those things are just like so big, and we don't talk about them like at all. We have like the idea, like I see them everywhere. It's like the people who like have the little like sign in their room or quote in their room, like you have a whole wall, right?
Yeah.
So it's like that kind of thing is like they say you should do it, but it's also like how impactful that is just so crazy.
Oh, it's huge for me.
Yeah. To be able to like just see something that reminds you to do that thing is like, yeah, it can be
I mean,
crazy.
it changes
It
who
will
I
change.
am.
Exactly.
Literally, it's like things that remind me of who I want to be, and if I'm reading them regularly, I start to change.
Exactly.
So
Yeah, it's very powerful. Did you have anything more you wanted to say on free will?
No, I mean, I think it pretty much sums up. Yeah, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
You're still gonna.
Well, I think it matters if we're gonna get into where it matters. The idea of it mattering is really important when it comes to trying to figure out if someone's guilty of something or not.
And what that means.
interesting.
Yeah.
And what that means, and what you do with the various people that sort of exist outside of society. Because if it's really not their fault, then what do you? The whole idea of punitive, like of just a system designed on punitive measures doesn't make any sense at that point.
that's
Right.
true. Yeah, it would literally do nothing.
No, and I mean, if you think about it from a standpoint of why we do that,
It actually does do nothing.
of why we do that, it's because we feel better that we punish this person for doing this bad thing.
Yeah.
But what do
But
you?
if
There's
we-
the idea of deterrence, but
Well, right, but really,
We know
if we look at the
psychologically that's
statistics,
not
it
true.
doesn't do that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so if we want to be intelligent about our our legal system or how we deal with criminals, the thing that makes the most sense is to look at the statistics of how we can integrate those people back into society
yeah,
and make
for
them
sure.
function the way that we've decided
But
is
I
right.
have that view of criminal justice, even having a point of view based on free will, but only because I think people are more defined by their environment most of the time than by their choices.
Mhm.
And I do think there are people who are more in control of their choices than others, again, depending on their circumstances, and that we can make a society more
Oh, totally.
conducive to that.
So one of the things that like I mean I need to research this more because I am interested in it enough to do it. But it's like the idea is that one of the functions of your prefrontal cortex, which is also where you like do a lot of your decision making, your quote unquote decision making, is selecting the information to take into consideration.
Yeah.
So like there's the idea that like people with higher IQs higher working memory capacity, which is those are different. Those are definitely different. Working memory capacity is the amount of information that you can hold that you can like work with.
Yeah.
And the idea is that people with higher working memory capacity can also ignore more things than people who have a lower working memory
So
capacity.
less impact. The stimuli is less impact on them.
Less noise.
Yeah, less noise is like the big thing. So
More RAM equals less noise.
Okay,
Got
speaking of IQ though, I know this
Yeah,
is a real
real.
bit of a tangent,
Uh-huh.
but talking again about that other talk we had where Chris was here, another point that really bothered me
oh yeah,
was the idea of like
hierarchy.
if you have a democratic system that like he was saying that like you need to have people with higher IQs in charge of things. And the idea of like people shouldn't elect their leaders because they're not going to choose the smartest leaders. And this kind of like meritocratic idea of things that I don't think plays itself out in reality. I mean, someone with a really high IQ could still crash the economy for their own benefit. Like IQ is not a measure of making things
Yeah, you're more
better for people.
That's true, but it also is very often highly correlated with aptitude at a given skill.
True.
Right.
But
And
if you
so
change-
that's I think what he was talking about is like
Yeah.
if you give control of a company to a bunch of people with a relatively low IQ, they may not choose the best course for the company in terms of that company surviving in a competitive environment.
I agree to a large extent with that. However, I think there's a couple things that balance that out. First of all, I think people with high IQ are still going to show up as the most convincing management material to be elected into positions of leadership. I think those who do make it into positions of leadership are going to have a better incentive structure to guide their intelligence and their behavior, because the incentive structure is going to be going towards what makes it better for the workers. And, what was the last thing? Anyway, that's...
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's really hard to say one way or another how that will play out.
Yeah.
But, you know...
Oh, well, the competition thing, sorry. But the last thing is that, like, yeah, there are going to be... I think if we switch to a democratic cooperative system, it would, for a while, a lot of them would probably make decisions that run into the ground. Mm-hmm. And I see that as a positive. And the reason I see that as a positive is because it's an increase in diversity. It really is an increase in market competition and choices. Because, I mean, a lot of, you know, the management practices we have in our hierarchical system have become homogenized. Mm-hmm. I mean, you trade executives from one company to another, and there's these playbooks, right. You know? Yeah. And you're going to have this radical experimentation with democracy, and that's going to mean failure.
Yeah,
but
for sure.
The ideology of a market is that failure is okay, as long as it spurs the improvement through that competition.
You couldn't be able to use it's basically you can't use that argument against democratic co-ops.
Yeah, if you're coming from the point of view of capitalism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
As well in capitalism.
That's true. I think one of the biggest issues is we look at a lot of the ways that democracies have worked, and oftentimes they do elect really bad leaders, right? And so
that's true. But we have to get into some really sticky conversations now about what is a democracy in terms of, you know, direct democracy in a workplace versus what we call democracy in a political system.
Right.
I mean, so take America, for example. I mean, you can't call this a democracy. It's a two-party system. You know, the majority doesn't even always carry the vote.
Yeah.
I mean, you have Donald Trump getting less than the majority, and he's president. So
definitely.
To use those as examples of a direct democracy in function, it doesn't really make sense. But
I think it's just there's a huge
mob mentality.
Yeah, and there's a lot of possibility for it to go wrong. I mean, like, not to say that our system now is perfect, of course, and comparing it to that, like, it's not to say that it's worse per se. It's just that one of the things that does work in terms of the way the capitalist system works is that it is highly merit-based when you get up into, like, competitive CEO level, you know, where, like, the best CEOs are the ones running the biggest companies, basically, and they are really, really intelligent people. And they
but
got
that
there for a
merit,
reason.
what is that merit being directed to?
And that's a bad, like, I agree that it's not being directed in a good way.
Right.
It's just a matter of whether or not you would be sort of dumbing down the pool of talent by using that type
maybe
of...
so. Maybe you're, you know, maybe you have this elite upper crust of talent now. But if we have to water that down in order to make a system that serves the people better, and B, gives them more autonomy over their own lives, then I'm in favor of that.
Do you have to dumb down the echelons to be able to make it more moral?
And you know what? I think...
Would you make that decision?
I think it would greatly... it would do the opposite to the regular worker. It would do the opposite of dumb them down. It would give them more autonomy, more interaction.
Dude, I hope to God we
right now we act like robots. You can't go any lower than now.
Yeah.
So if you mean we're going to have to water down, you know, the elites so that the common people can take a few steps up, I'm game.
Yeah,
I'm game with that.
And you know, one of the biggest hopes that I could see is maybe that talent pool would head for other realms where they could, you know, use their IQ better.
Right.
You know, because maybe being a CEO wouldn't be as rewarding anymore.
Yeah, maybe you need to go into government. Maybe you need to do different things.
Maybe become an awesome physicist now.
Yeah,
exactly.
But I mean, one of the examples I look to is, you know, what happened in ancient Athens, and what we saw there was almost the opposite, where you have these, you know, entrenched aristocrat or oligarch-based city-states, and sure, you have like these elites who know what they're doing, but it got very, stagnant, and they made, you know, choices based off kind of like traditions about how things work. And you have Athens coming up with this like bold, fierce, you know, innovative, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? Individualism. And you had people coming from nothing and becoming these, you know, superstars in terms of the political arena, and they made a lot of choices that benefited them that shocked other city-states because they were willing to gamble big.
Totally.
And I think there's a lot of generative capacity in that as well. But that's that's an age-old argument. Is it better to have concentrated power or egalitarian power?
Yeah.
And the whole arena of ancient Greece is one wonderful experiment of all those things taking place.
I also think it's interesting to think about this argument in the context of AI coming soon.
Right.
Because, what happens when that kind of hits the fan and now all of a sudden we don't really need workers at companies anymore. And then it's like, well, okay, how are you going to have a democratic co-op with 2 people, 3 people? It's basically...
Yeah, that's interesting.
I mean, that's still in the future.
It's true.
But
that
is going to be
20, 30 years.
I'm assuming
maybe
we're
50.
going to create some kind of job market in that world where the jobs just are doing different things. Maybe they're now more luxury and service based.
Yeah.
Unless we think we're literally just not going to have jobs for people, and that's another alternative to talk about.
Yeah.
But as long as jobs exist, I'd rather them be run democratically.
We'll have a sweet VR system by then, so it doesn't
yeah, so just plug in and unplug.
There you go. We'll create economic systems in the VR where there aren't any AIs that people can still function in.
There you go.
Oh my god,
So
the
they
kinds of
pretend
VR.
the kinds of AI simulations. I mean, we should just have AI just try to understand as much about humans as possible and then run experiments about different kinds of systems for us to live in.
They could do that, I'm sure.
And then
Crazy.
they can put us in little batteries that are filled
Yeah.
with little gelatinous things that plug our brains in and use us for batteries. That would be great.
Why not?
We don't need them anymore.
I mean, not really.
Oh my
They're
I'm
giving
joining
us
the
what
revolution,
we need.
guys.
All we gotta do is power them. Seems fair.
Free yourself.
There is definitely a piece of me that's just like, okay, so we just decided the Matrix was a good thing. Okay, cool. That's literally, I'm just like, okay.
Well, it's also like,
fuck that.
if the world is
That's-
like that.
I don't see
It's so
the point
fucked
of
up.
the AI thing if that's what that's I think what the people are thinking about right there. We can't solve our problems ourselves, so we're gonna create this other thing that we don't really care because we're like no longer the
but
responsibility.
That's a tough thing though, because
We
I feel
sure
like we
did.
were able to solve our problems before our civilizational constructs. I really like,
Depends on what you consider solving in our problems.
right, it was messy. Sure, I'm not saying everything was, utopian back during hunter-gatherer times, but I think that's when humans were at our best.
Boy, I don't know about that.
In terms of individual fulfillment and that kind of thing. But anthropologists do say that
Yeah,
they
no,
do
that's-
say
that's
that
hunter-gatherer
weird.
societies are much happier
Exactly.
than modern civilization.
But
They
they
worked
didn't live
less.
They worked less.
They didn't live as long.
But they worked less. They were.
I'll take
happier.
that, man. I'll take
And they had
that.
stimulation all the time. They didn't need any of this stuff because they had stimulation all the time. However, that probably also led to probably got them dying a lot because of the
Yeah,
things
the
that were
healthcare
stimulating them being like a
was
freaking
not-
Yeah.
needing to look for food and then a lion coming and eating you.
But that just happens one
That's
day.
the-
We don't worry about it.
They definitely worried about that.
They
No,
did,
it was
but not-
normal for them though. You know
Not
what I
to
mean?
the point of dread. Though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, everyone's afraid of lions, man. I'm not saying they're not afraid of lions,
Good reason.
but there's not that constant state of
A hippo
anxiety
ain't.
that we have in
A
civilization.
hippo ain't afraid of nothing.
I mean,
Hippopotamuses are like.
There's some
The
hippos
only
that are
reason
eaten
why
by lions, so
You
it
think
should
that
be.
there's
Maybe.
more anxiety? That'd be
Okay,
interesting.
let me explain why I think that.
Yeah.
So in some of the anthropology papers I was reading, they were saying that there is a general lower state of anxiety in hunter-gatherer groups than in people in civilization. And they pointed to one of the main reasons of that is that they don't have the same concept of time that we do.
Okay, yeah, for sure.
And that was
I
one
can
of
see
the
that.
main sources of it for
Yeah.
us is this idea of linear time and this idea of this existential need to improve your position.
Yeah, that's
Whereas
what
in
I was
hunter
gonna
gatherers, you
say.
get your food,
Yeah.
you sit down by the fire, and you tell stories and you fuck each other.
Yeah, I mean that's one of
That's
the
what
biggest
you
things
do.
I can see is we always. It doesn't matter at what point we are in our lives. There's always some sort of pressure.
Yeah.
It seems like I mean you can decide whether or not to let that bother you if you're a unique individual, but most people are gonna
Yeah.
feel that kind of pressure at almost all of their life until maybe they retire, and then
Yeah.
there's not, like, it kind of is like, okay, you've done your due, and that's when we see a lot of people become as happy as they've ever been, right? And so, yeah, I think that's a huge one. It's like, you know, you get a new job, and it's not like, okay, well, it's like buy a house, you know, buy a car, get a wife, have a kid, you know, there's like all these things that it's like, you better check these things off or
Yeah.
you're not going to be happy, and people just tell you that, and so we assume that they're right
Yeah,
for whatever reason.
It's imbued in you at a
Mhm.
very young age in all
Exactly.
of your life.
So it makes sense that a hunter-gatherer society wouldn't have those kinds of pressures, and then therefore they would be a lot happier. You
Yeah.
know? But it's also when
And
you
then
say
just being
that,
in nature all the time too is its own thing.
right. When you say that we were at our best, though, it's interesting because, you know, that's like by what measure?
Yeah, it's
We
tough.
were at
We
our
should dig
happiest?
into that.
That's fine.
I guess I mean
that's
more,
definitely an important thing, an important metric.
Let me re-say that. I don't think that we're at our best.
Okay.
What I mean is, in my view, the things most important to me about life, I feel like we've lost, and I feel like we still have them then. And those have a lot to do with, you know, a connection to community, a connection to nature, a sense of autonomy, and of, you know, personal freedom.
I mean, I think those things are definitely important, and I think a huge case can be made for us establishing a society where we can have those,
Right.
and not
And that's really
necessarily
what I'm-
needing to continue to progress. Like
Yeah.
that's one of those things that we were talking about earlier. You know, the Native Americans didn't seem to feel the need to progress endlessly like the Europeans did for whatever reason,
Yeah.
right? And a lot of it could be because of their inherent ideas on, you know, self-actualization and how to get there, as opposed to Europeans' idea of, you know, continuous improvement, right? And so whether or not one is superior to the other is hard to really say, you know, but obviously one is more successful in creating happy,
Right.
self-actualized people than
Right.
the other. And so I think definitely a marriage of the two ideas is a good
I agree
idea.
entirely.
Yeah.
And what I really come to is that I feel like that need for progression, in a large sense, you know, it comes from us being in civilization, the construct of civilization itself. You know, that entity, the state, the powers, structures, have their own incentives to progress. And then also, we feel the need to progress because of all the psychological things we were just talking about, that anxiety, that cultural context.
Right.
And, you know, maybe I think it's safe to say we never would have got the benefits of that state of existence without civilization.
Mm-hmm.
I think now we can look at that, take the benefits without the horrible negative things that cause it, and have a society more like our hunter-gatherer model in a civilizational context, and yet still be trying to, you know, innovate, to create new things, but not maddeningly, not to the point of like risking our own extinction.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
basically the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
Well, one of the big things that like I think is cool about what like Carl Jung started to like elucidate, but also what Jordan Peterson is working on now is like the idea of like being able to abstract what we can from these stories that we've been telling ourselves for a long time, like both with like religion, but also with like the hero tale and stuff like that. Well, Campbell too, I guess. Joseph Campbell is a big one too. But the idea like that I think is most relevant to like what you guys are talking about is like back in the day it was like, oh shit, I made a new kind of bow and now we kill things way easier. Sweet. Everyone in society benefits now, right? Now it's like we look around and we're like, do I have enough food? Yeah. Do I have enough water? Yeah. Do I have enough covering? Yeah. For a lot of us, not everyone, which is also like a big deal. But it's like we don't wake up every morning being like, you know, it could be better if we could like kill more food or something like that.
Right.
You know, we have to make these more complex systems where it's like, okay, well, I could make more money. Do I want to make more money? I guess. Why not? And then so you can go and like try and figure out intellectually what would be the best thing to like work towards in like the technology company that, you know, you might not really understand what the purpose of this like new song is, or this new tool is, or this new whatever
it'll
is,
make you more
but
money.
it'll make me more money, so I guess that's
See,
benefiting
it's so
society, right?
abstracted too.
Exactly.
I mean, the fact that there's so many people just like trying to make ends meet and they don't see any clear way to better their circumstances is just so depressing.
I mean, you like look at it's like if you look at our idols too. It's like look at like Steve Jobs, or even just like those aren't, I don't think are bad ones, but like even like just like the creation of like the iPod, is that really like as big a deal as like Prometheus bringing down a torch, you know,
Yeah.
for humanity to now have fire? Is that really like, is that the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, I
Is
wouldn't put it
there-
on the same level, but I do think it was that idea, like that idea explosion, did bring music to people in a new way.
Totally, and
Which is
that's,
awesome.
I'm just saying I
Changes
don't
people's lives.
know if I don't know if we've adapted our, I don't know if we've caught up with that kind of change in abstraction, or at least the content for that abstraction. Because if you want to take it there, it's like that gave like music, which is a great, it's a great artistic thing to give people, right? But it's not physical. It's not
Right.
not the new gun,
Totally.
right? Which we still do anyways. But it's like, I think that would be, I think a lot of people would agree that that kind of stuff would be the best thing that we could make, something like that benefits everyone, rather than the few, which I think is one of the biggest parts of our society that everyone's kind of pissed off at right now. It's
Yeah.
like, we're not even creating things anymore that benefits everyone. We're just creating things that benefit some people.
Yeah.
Right.